Hello guys, welcome to the fiction series. Today we are gonna see, what if Naruto x Azula x my x Ty Lee x Toph? The movie. Huge shout out to Bigtrunk for this story. If you want more awesome fanfiction like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. So without wasting any time, let's get into the video. It had been a long, grueling year and a half for Iroh. Being raised in this war-torn world with his brother had certainly left its effect. The great and powerful Fire Nation had started a war for conquest, now spanning a century. Ever since he was a boy, all he's known was war, forced upon himself and his younger brother Ozai, both having been trained and tutored from birth. As the crown prince of the Fire Nation, it was forced into him how to act, how to behave, and how to rule. His father claimed he had done many great things, but nothing would compare to his conquest of Ba Sing Se, the unreachable city. Many before him have tried, many before him had failed, but he was Iroh, the dragon. Nothing could stop him, or so he thought. Iroh lost much in this war: soldiers, friends, but worst of all, family. His only son, Prince Luten, died in the line of duty, serving under his father. The loss was too much for Iroh, breaking the hardened general like fragile glass. It was well known that something about the man had changed. No longer were his tactics effective in battle, his once amazing fire bending that once made armies tremble now dwindled to nothing more than an ember. This was the start of his massive decline. Having enough sense to know when he was fighting a losing battle, the general began his long retreat to the coast where he could lick his wounds and return home. His army marched with him, tired, depressed, and defeated, all wishing to be with their families or mourn for their fallen brethren, though that would have to come much later as they stumbled on an ally's village. Once thriving with life, now ashen ruins, Iroh held his hand out, watching with a critical eye as a gray little flake rested in his palm. Volcanic ash, sir? The once fierce general was broken out of his thoughts, brushing his hands as he turned to face his lieutenant. Our orders: search the surrounding areas. There might be some survivors if we're lucky. Sir, if we can't find any survivors? Iroh's silence spoke for him. With a hesitant nod and bow, he left the pondering general to his thoughts. The great dragon of the West felt his heart break. Every man, woman, and child brought a deep sorrow, plaguing his thoughts full of what ifs and if only. Iroh didn't know how long he spent walking and mourning the dead. He did have enough sense to notice that the sun was beginning to set, and a cold chill ran up his spine. Setting a brisk pace, the general started a march back to his men, hoping to meet some survivors. However, something caught the old dragon's attention. His years of military service, sharpening all his senses to a fine point. With no hesitance, Iroh followed his instincts, eyes widening at the small building. The only way you would find such a place would be if you went out of your way to find it, meaning someone built this with the intention of keeping it hidden. Ember-colored eyes narrowed in precaution, his heart steadying to a single beat. It wasn't hard to notice the poor condition the building was in, but it wasn't like the other from the village, no. This was very much the same as a prison or a dungeon. Wearily, he inspected every nook and cranny until he rounded the corner, aghast at what he found. It was indeed a prison, but it was what was behind the bars that was so stomach-turning. Piled up inside the prison were two large bodies, clearly adults. They laid side by side, no different to a couple who went off to bed. Iroh couldn't be sure of their cause of death, but he hoped it was quick. As the saddened general was about to leave, he noticed something in the corner of his eye. Near lifeless blue eyes met his ember. Iroh rushed inside the cell. Being mindful of the dead, he made his way over to the small malnourished boy, crouching so as not to frighten the child. Offering a kind smile, the general tried asking some questions, but unfortunately received silence in return. Pale blue with flecks of orange, like fire and ice melting together in form of unholy matrimony, there was no fear within those orbs, only pure unadulterated hatred and a deep feral anger. Just as Iroh was about to open the cage, a scream of pain sounded, then horns of war, and then the rumble of moving earth. The Earth Kingdom had found them. Iroh rushed back to the main square to see his army engaging the earth-bending forces. For every fire-bender that fell, 2 earth-benders fell, yet more took their place. The combat was wild and fierce. Huge shelves of earth moved and crushed all those in their path. Enormous storms of fire raged and ate all that stood before them. But it wasn't enough. Even as Iroh and his personal guard joined the fray, blasting and scorching bender after bender, none could stand against his flames. All that challenged him became naught but ash in the wind. Even then, however, it wasn't enough. Firebenders started disappearing into the ground, dragged down by unseen earthbender soldiers. Iroh cursed. The death of his son still weighed heavily upon his mind, hampering his usually incredible fighting ability. That's when everything changed. The village that the two opposing armies clashed in was surrounded by 3 large volcanoes acting as the guardians to the village known as the 3 Sleeping Kings, for they had been dormant since the time of the first Avatar, or so the legends go. They weren't dormant anymore. The ground rumbled and cracked, magma spewed up through the cracks as if a wrathful spirit was breaking free. Iroh had never seen anything like this. Hot ash spewed from the 3 volcanoes. Both Earthbender and Firebender alike struggled to gain their balance as the ground rumbled and shook. An Earthbender screamed as a meteor of hot rock crushed him, thrown from one of the volcanoes. A roar cut through the sounds of battle, a primal hair-raising sound. Iroh turned, the hair on the back of his neck rising rapidly with the temperature. A small shape flew past him, and Iroh's eyes widened, the shadow he'd seen in the cell. It was a child. A child that now tore through earthbenders and firebenders alike with reckless abandon. The most surprising part, however, was the molten rock covering the child's arms, forming long crimson claws that steamed with each swipe, cutting through multiple bodies like a knife through butter. The kid roared and stomped on the ground, creating a huge chasm that swallowed a dozen earthbenders. He paused and turned, looking at Iroh. He approached slowly, his dark blue-orange eyes filled with curiosity. The child had shaggy long blonde hair, matted with dried blood, gore and dirt. His body was malnourished and scarred. His gauntlets of molten rock dripped off his hand and fell onto a body of an earthbender that lay below him, melting straight through the body of the already dead bender. He took another step forward. The rags that formed his clothes were stiff with dust and crinkled with every movement. Around them the volcanoes finally started to slow in their eruptions, their rumblings beginning to slow after their explosions. The child approached Iroh and his remaining bodyguards. The guards stiffened and prepared themselves to fight, stepping forward to defend their lord, only for Iroh to lift his arm. "My lord, we do not know if he is." The guard began, only to be cut off by a sharp look from Iroh. The child stopped and stared at the guard. He bared his teeth in anger. However, Iroh slowly knelt down to the child's level. "Do not worry, you have nothing to fear from me or my men," Iroh said softly as he gauged the child's reaction. He hadn't stopped staring at the guards, but he'd at least stopped baring his teeth. A good sign so far. "What is your name, child?" Iroh asked as the child approached him slowly. The child beeped his head to the right in a curious manner. "What is your name?" Iroh repeated, this time in a slower manner. The child still looked confused. "My name is Iroh," he said slowly as he pointed to himself, trying to get the child to understand. The child's eyes seemed to light up slightly at that. It seemed he finally understood. "Naruto," the child basically whispered, his voice hoarse and rough. "I am Naruto," he whispered out before breaking out into coughs, his grimy head shuddering with the movement. Iroh looked at Naruto. Concern flashed across his eyes. "How old are you and where are your parents?" He prodded. He winced as tears began to gather in Naruto's eyes and the child started to sob uncontrollably. "My parents," he paused, hiccuping, "were killed in cell," he finished, lifting his head to the sky and letting out a soul-piercing wail. The soldiers around them turned away from him, and some even shed a tear, barely seeming to understand what it was like to lose a family. Iroh, on the other hand, eyes widened in sadness and shock as he remembered the state of the bodies. "If no one was here when we arrived, he must have had to eat the flesh of this poor child," Iroh thought somberly to himself. He then squared his shoulders and brought him into a hug. The boy stiffened, his claw-blackened digits almost brought to bear against the man, only for Iroh to tighten his hold on Naruto. Iroh slowly rose to his full height. Looking down at Naruto, he spoke quietly, "Come, child. Let us get you cleaned up." With that, he began to walk towards the center of the broken and battered husk of a village. Around him, the soldiers both tended to the wounded and began to wearily set up camp. Some just slumped in doorways or laid down in the houses that were left as skeletons after the attack. As Iroh and Naruto walked through the camp, many men stared at the child beside their lord. Some whispered, telling each other the story of his attack and his unusual bending abilities. Others simply glared, eyes boring straight into him, and Naruto stared back unafraid until they finally reached Iroh's tent. What Iroh did not see, however, was the messenger hawk taking off from the back of the camp. On its back was a canister strapped to it, a black ribbon. It had been 2 weeks of long travel and hard-fought retreats since Iroh had found Naruto in his village. The child had learned much from Iroh, the man teaching him basic meditation among other things including basic bending. However, it was found that Naruto's bending was different to the bending of the earthbenders. He could bend both earth and fire, mixing the two to create one of the hottest substances they could find: lava. His earth and fire bending came to him naturally, as if he were born bending. His proficiency with fire, however, is what drew Iroh's attention. Flashback. It had been a week since they had found the boy, and Iroh had taken him under his wing for meditation to both calm his nerves and help him with his trauma. One day, Iroh was going through his usual bending stances in a clearing in a forest they'd stopped for rest, flowing through the movements resulting in a huge gout of fire. Behind him he heard an almost silent grunt. He smiled in amusement as he turned to see Naruto trying to copy the forms. For an apparent earthbender, he had an extreme and unusual proficiency for the dance of dragons. Iroh turned to him with a small smile. Naruto, if you wanted to learn you could have simply asked. I am always willing to teach, Iroh admonished lightly. Naruto bobbed his head up and down in acknowledgement. I didn't want to bother you during your exercise, said Naruto, staring at the ground, head held down. Iroh simply shook his head before sliding into the opening stance. Naruto lifted his head and smiled slightly before taking the same horse stance as his teacher. Feel the warmth flow through you even as an earthbender. The feeling of Mother Earth should be clear, and when it builds up, let it out as a fluid movement. With that, Iroh flung a fist forward and a jet of flames spewed forth before burning out. Naruto nodded in excitement before concentrating. Feel the warmth and Mother Earth. Let it flow, Naruto thought, as he felt a different sort of warmth flow through him, and it built up till it was painful, and let it out. With that, Naruto flung his arm forward, copying Iroh move for move. However, it wasn't what they were expecting. It wasn't the earth that moved with his movement. Fire, almost liquidized fire, erupted from Naruto's hands. The heat was immense as it burned the surrounding foliage, reducing most of it to ash. It was a dark, bloody crimson color, and it shocked both Iroh and Naruto himself, not expecting the ability. You can bend two elements? That should be impossible, Iroh gasped, his eyes wide with curiosity and confusion filling them. Iroh stood abruptly and grabbed Naruto, bringing him close. You cannot let anyone know about this, my boy. If they do, who knows what they'd do to you, Iroh whispered urgently, grabbing Naruto's attention. The boy nodded silently, not understanding the sheer magnitude of his ability. Iroh pulled him over and they both sat down Saiza style, beginning their meditation practice. Naruto slowly lost himself to the meditation, his spirit delving deep within his own body. He finally felt at peace. Flashback end. Naruto was brought out of his meditation as Iroh approached and stood in front of him. The man looked down at the boy. Naruto, we still have 2 weeks before we reach the Fire Nation with our ships. We are moving slowly to avoid Earth Nation patrols. Because of this, we will be training and meditating every day till then on the deck for now, he said warmly, getting Naruto's direct attention. The boy nodded and stood following Iroh as the man walked down the gangway toward the rear of the warship. Reaching the quarterdeck, both stripped down to training trousers and began moving through the training katas, flowing through the movements as if it were natural. Each movement was smooth and concise. Iroh nodded as he watched Naruto continue the movements. That's enough, Naruto. Now, I am going to teach you one of the bending routines that allowed me to gain the name Dragon of the West. Naruto heard a small crack in the man's voice as he mentioned his title. Naruto's eyes softened slightly, understanding the man's pain to an extent. Standing next to the older man, he watched as the man went through the maneuvers he called the Dance of the Dragon. Naruto watched closely, the movements being fluid and powerful. He could feel the fire within him begin to bubble and boil as the dance finished with a massive gout of flame. Iroh nodded to himself and signaled to Naruto to copy his movements. Step by step, the boy flawlessly copied the older man's movements. Each phase was powerful and clean, letting out huge blasts of molten fire. Iroh stepped away in awe. Even a master of the technique did not show the sheer proficiency for the technique when he was this boy's age. It was as if the boy was raised by the dragons himself. The boy finished off the dance with an enormous spout of flame that simply hovered for a couple moments before dissipating into the air. Iroh strode over, his eyes wide, filled with pride and curiosity among other things. Slight fear was present too, which Naruto picked up on, but he pushed it to the back of his mind, storing that thought for now. Good job, my boy. That was amazing. I haven't seen anyone be so attuned to the Dance of the Dragons since my great-grandfather. It is almost like the fire itself loves you, he said, proudly placing a hand on Naruto's shoulder. The boy felt the surge of happiness stream through him, warming his heart ever so much. The wholesome mood was then broken as the large doors to the training deck were pushed open. 2 guards wearing full red armor with helmets fashioned into human skulls walked into the training deck. Iroh pushed Naruto behind him slightly and stood to his full height. "What is it? Why have you interrupted?" he asked, a singular eyebrow raised in slight confusion. The guard on the left stepped forward and bowed, speaking as he did so. "Lord Iroh, we have arrived at Capital Island and are roughly an hour away from docking in the harbor," the guard spoke in a low, reverent voice. Iroh's eyes flashed to the small, curious form of Naruto, who still wore his training gi. Iroh finally made up his mind on what he had to do. Iroh kneeled down in front of Naruto. "Naruto, go to your room and get dressed. There will be special robes waiting for you on your bed." Iroh smiled slightly after he'd said this. "You'll soon be somewhere where you can be looked after and cared for." Naruto nodded and gave the man a slight smile before running off to his room. Iroh slowly stood and watched him leave, his smile turning thoroughly into a frown. Iroh stormed onto the bridge of his ship, a scowl etched onto his face. "Why was I not informed of our arrival into Fire Nation waters, as I had asked for earlier?" he asked, his voice stern and filled with heat. The bridge crew all bowed before Iroh in apology. "I am sorry, my lord, but warships from the capital itself forced us to change course to the main harbor. Something about the Fire Lord wishing to see you immediately when you arrive. With or without your approval," the captain answered, his head low, but it was obvious he didn't care for Iroh's feelings on the matter. "Alert me when we arrive at the palace docks and send a message to my father that I have arrived home," Iroh spoke, his voice now frigid and terrifying. The captain nodded and Iroh left the bridge. He was concerned. What if his father had found out about the young man that had become something akin to a son to him? There was no way he'd give up Naruto without a fight. The boy had too much potential and was too dangerous to end up in Ozai or Azulin's hands. Iroh walked down the hallway. He strode quickly toward Naruto's room and knocked on the something that sounded like a come-in. He pushed the large ornate door open. Standing in front of the bed, Naruto was dressed in the crimson and gold of the royal family. He had an ornate gold fire hairpin which held a few of the larger spikes together, forming something similar to a pineapple shape. Naruto looked up at Iroh, asking a silent question. "You look great, my child, like a true firebender," at which Naruto smiled slightly and nodded in thanks. Iroh knelt down and drew up a serious grimace. "Now, Naruto, we will be docking soon and my father has requested that we go and see him. I'm going to need you to be brave, but when they ask you anything you need to answer, okay?" Iroh asked him seriously. Naruto nodded. Iroh could see the slight apprehension within the boy and hugged him lightly. The crackle of the intercom drew Iroh's attention. "Lord Iroh, we've arrived and begun the docking process." The radio's crackles silenced as Iroh cursed silently, wishing for a bit more time. He turned to Naruto and gave him another reassuring smile before signaling for the boy to follow him up to the main deck. Once they arrived onto the deck, Naruto was taken aback by the sight before him. Hundreds of thousands of people, all stood arrayed in a parade-like form. Once Iroh had come out into the light, showing himself to the crowd, they burst into cheers. Despite the loss, the safety of the most favored son of the royal family was enough to raise some spirits. Despite this, however, Iroh could still see some of the mourning families and mothers grieving for their lost sons. Iroh bowed his head slightly as he walked down the gangplank toward where the palanquin awaited him. Behind, Naruto was wide-eyed, his head swiveling from side to side, taking in all the sights and sounds. Never before in his short life had he seen or been around so many people. Many of the crowd spotted him and began to whisper, while others pointed and openly called out. However, these were silenced when Iroh helped up Naruto onto the palanquin. It was something akin to the silence before the storm. The crowd exploded into cheers. Somehow seeing the young boy the prince had brought home had raised spirits immediately. Some believed him to be freeing dignitary captured in the retreat from the citadel, while others believed him to be some young prince captured in a daring raid on the Earth King's summer palace. None, however, realized him to be something even greater. Naruto stayed silent for the entire journey, his eyes being locked onto the fast-approaching palace. It was at this moment he wondered, could Iroh actually help him fulfill his dream of wiping away the Earth Kingdom? Although he believed Iroh to be something similar to a father figure, he still didn't truly trust the man. After all he had known had left him. At that thought, a small tear slid out of his eye and trailed its way down his cheek. However, he was quick to wipe it away once they arrived at the gates of the large palace. Iroh stepped off the palanquin first, He carried an unusually serious air about him as he entered the palace, his young ward following dutifully behind. The air changed immediately as they entered the palace's throne room. Naruto could feel it. Pure danger, pure anger. The throne room would have been sweltering for anyone but the strongest of firebenders. Merely breathing at first seemed to scald and burden Naruto's throat and lungs. However, he slowly grew used to the heat despite only being there for a couple minutes at most. He followed behind Iroh as they made their way toward the base of the throne itself. An absolutely enormous blaze stood in between them and the Fire Nation's seat of power. On the throne, Naruto could just about see the outline of an elderly man behind the raging flames. However, he could feel the immense presence the man gave off. To their immediate right, a door opened, and in walked a man, a woman and 2 kids, the tall man that resembled Iroh to an extent. However, he wasn't as well wide as his older brother. However, his form conveyed both power and agility. The woman behind him was the picture of beauty, her long black hair falling down to her knees held up only by the ponytail it was formed into with the symbol fire holding it together. Behind her stood a very cute girl, her gold/amber eyes peering into and capturing his own blue orbs. Her black hair was held up in a bun with the flame hairpin holding it together. Bangs fell either side of her head framing her small face. Naruto could see the visible curiosity behind those bright orbs. Behind her walked a scrawny teen, his hair held in a top knot. The boy didn't give the image of confidence, for if he was a prince and Naruto was sure a stiff breeze would probably blow him over. His coal-black eyes also locked onto Naruto's. However, they were more jealous than anything else, sparking some confusion from Naruto. The group stopped and bowed down to the figure in the fire, their heads touching the ground, Iroh and Naruto following suit. A short time after, it was silent for a time before he spoke. "Who is this child you have brought before me, Iroh?" The voice was low and croaky, yet it still demanded respect. Iroh sat up and looked at his father, his eyes never reaching the figure's own. "Father, he is the child I found on the march toward the coast." He showed an almost unnatural bending ability at which the fire grew intense. "You dare bring a filthy earthbender to my palace?" As he spoke it, and it was as if a dragon itself had responded to Iroh's words. Naruto could see the sweat rolling down both his father's figure and the others' faces, but the other man's face, however, was as strong as ever. Naruto stood, ignoring the whispers, to kneel down from Iroh. "My lord, my name is Naruto, no last name. Born in a disgraced village and left to rot by those same bastards you call earthbenders." He paused slightly, and the Fire Lord sat up slightly. The flames surrounding him began to grow hotter and hotter, becoming wispy and turning into a bright vermilion color, drawing all eyes to him. It was completely silent for a time, before the Fire Lord let out a loud booming laugh. "Child, you believe yourself arrogant enough to speak to me in such a way?" The man spoke. The controls of the flames wrestled away from the boy, blue overcoming the bright red. Iroh stood quickly enough. "Naruto, father, the boy is trained within the ways of our own. He can bend in a way I have never seen before." At hearing that, the flames surrounding the Fire Lord cooled slightly. "Show me." Iroh turned to the boy and kneeled down. "Despite your..." He paused slightly, giving Naruto a dry look. "Outburst. You have to show father your bending. I know your bending is powerful, but do not show everything," he whispered, his voice low and serious. Naruto simply nodded, filing away the man's warning for later. Stepping forward, the man's young ward bowed before the Fire Lord. The man leaned forward slightly, and at an invisible signal, 2 men entered the room. Both wore the Fire Guard armor, their helmets fashioned into the shape of a human skull with iron horns protruding from their skulls. They marched forward completely in sync, as if they were automatons. Both men kneeled at the foot of the throne. "These men shall be your test, boy. They shall show me if you are truly worthy of my attention." With a single clap, the test began. The center of the hall was cleared as an almost impenetrable barrier of flame appeared around all 3 combatants, sealing them in. The 2 men stood tall and began to circle the boy between them, their stances low and maneuverable. The first man threw a fist forward, sending a cascading wave of fire toward Naruto, who had stayed completely still, and remained so even as the fire washed over him. The cascade of flames began to swirl, forming a whirlpool around the boy. The flames themselves seemed to not harm him, as if the spirits of fire and ash seemed to favor him. The flames surrounding him began to compress, growing smaller and covering his arms. At this, the Fire Lord sat forward and narrowed his eyes. The flames formed 2 claws of intense flame. He lifted his right hand, pointing at the guard who had instigated the battle. The flames around his arm pulsed as it shot forward in a stream of intense death. He dived out of the way, barely avoiding the heat death. The other guard capitalized upon Naruto's distracted state and flung 2 fireballs at him, both of which circled around each other before exploding into 100 smaller fireballs, peppering Naruto's positions and forcing him to jump out of the way. As he did so, he formed an orb of compressed liquid fire in his hand. The orb was about the size of a marble and a bright gold/white. It emanated pure heat. Naruto flicked the orb toward the guard on the left, catching him slightly off guard by how unassuming the attack looked. That was until the attack punched a bullet-sized hole through the guard. As it did so, the area around the hole dried out completely, turning to ash as he fell forward dead onto the ground. Behind the fight, Ozai's eyes narrowed and plans began to formulate within his mind. The other guard had no reaction to his companion's death, apart from spewing a wide stream of fire. Forcing Naruto to jump away from him and us his claws to absorb any excess fire, Naruto responded with his own fire blast, as if emulating an enraged dragon. Liquidized fire erupted out of his open maw, burning the air itself. The guard barely managed to raise a defense which shattered under Naruto's relentless onslaught. Half of the man's upper body had been burned away. Behind him he heard retching, however Naruto paid no mind, focusing on the target in front of him. He winced slightly as he could feel the slight burns on his arms. Despite his resistance to the flames, extended use did hurt him somewhat, especially with how close it was to his skin, coating it like a second layer around his arms and hands. He watched the man's charred body breathe in and out slowly. He could feel something building up. An intense heat. The half-dead man breathed in and out, the flames forming the barrier rose and fell with him. Naruto crouched, preparing for any attack. The guard appeared in front of him. His charred, half-melted hand reached toward Naruto's face, aiming to kill him in a single shot. His hand came close, his palm almost touching his nose. Naruto's eyes widened, his pupils dilating and his body reacting on its own. The man's hand fell away before he could touch him, burned completely to ash, followed by the rest of his arm. The guard grunted in pain as he fell backwards, his body burned beyond healing. Complete silence filled the hall. No one dared to speak. "Leave us," Azula spoke, his voice conveying no feeling. The woman standing next to the man on the other side of the room left, followed by her apparent children, all leaving with their heads bowed. Naruto himself left, not wishing to draw the wrath of Iroh nor Azula. Outside of the hall he stood silently on the balcony, looking out over the Fire Nation. Uncertainty filled him at Azula's decision. Would the old man allow him to continue to live and learn under Iroh, or would he have him killed outright? "Hello, what is your name?" "Mine is Azula, Princess of the Fire Nation." Naruto turned to face where the voice had come from and came face to face with the girl he'd seen earlier. "Your fire-bending skills are impressive. Who taught you those styles?" Her eyes narrowed slightly as Naruto continued to stare, his eyes filled with uncertainty and confusion. Finally he spoke. "Lord Iroh taught me most of what I know, the rest came naturally." She leaned back slightly, a small grin stretched across her face. I would like to see some more. If my grandfather doesn't have you killed, would you like to be my friend?" She leaned closer into Naruto, her amber eyes gripping him tightly. Naruto froze. He couldn't remember the last friend he'd had. Spending most of his time in a cage had done nothing to help with the social skills of the 11-year-old. Naruto nodded slowly, his eyes warming slightly. Azula's grin seemed to widen. With such a powerful friend, who wouldn't be happy? "Now, let's hope grandfather decides to keep you alive. After all, we can't be friends if you're dead." Naruto gulped slowly, however he seemed to grow more confident in that moment too. He wouldn't lose his newest friend if he could help it. "Azula, come on, mother is calling us." A slightly squeaky voice called out from behind the two. Both of them turned to face the voice. Azula's face showed exasperation, while Naruto's own portrayed curiosity. Walking quickly toward them was the boy Naruto had seen earlier. The boy eyed him warily, slowing down near to but not close to them, keeping at least 2 feet between himself and Naruto. "You didn't have to kill them, you know. You could have forced them to surrender or something. It wasn't a fight to the death." Naruto stared at him in both disbelief and annoyance. "If you had been in that fight, you would have known why I had to do what I did. It was nothing but self-defense." Azula grinned slightly as she watched the sparks fly between the two, her eyes moving from her brother to her new friend rapidly. "Oh, poor Zuzu. This is something you have to learn, big brother. Sometimes you have to be vicious. We're firebenders. We don't allow our enemies to escape," Azula responded, breaking into the conversation before it could get any frostier. Before anyone could speak, the large doors were opened and out walked 2 fire sages. "The Fire Lord has finished his." Azula. Prince Zuko, the older one, said, His voice low and gravelly, the three kids bowed, and turned to follow the sages. Azula and the now-known Zuko walked directly behind the sages while Naruto walked a few steps behind them, as even at his age he knew that he couldn't stand near the royals. As they re-entered the room, Naruto saw the two kids walk over to what he assumed to be their mother. Iroh and their father also stood off to one side together, however neither looked nor talked to each other, and even Naruto could feel the tension between the came to a stop in the center of the throne room. His heart began to pound in his ears as he kneeled down and awaited the Azulan's decision. Boy, I should have you killed for your insolence today. I should strip the skin from your bones. However, you have shown me something incredibly interesting. You have garnered the attention of both of my sons. And as such I shall do you a favor. The man paused, taking in a deep breath. You shall be taken to the island of the rising sun, where you shall be trained by the captain of the Phoenix Legion, until you either die or become strong enough to best thee, and only then shall I assign you to one of my sons. Now leave my sight and prepare yourself. Naruto stiffened at first, but he stood and bowed to the Fire Lord, slowly walking backwards to the grand doors of the throne room where Iroh and the other men were waiting. Between Iroh and his brother stood a tall, powerful man wearing bright red and gold gilded armor. Over his shoulder laid a blade handle. The man had a short cropped black beard and a buzz cut. Iroh saw him and smiled. Welcome, Naruto. Despite the outcome, this is the best. With my training and the infamous training of the captain here, you will grow up to be a fine man and warrior. Remember to take care of yourself, and don't forget your studies, for intelligence can make you as strong as any master bender. Naruto nodded and smiled slightly as he turned to face the captain and Ozai. I will be watching your career with great interest. Do not disappoint me. After he said this, Ozai turned and left Azula, waving to Naruto as she left with her parents. Iroh gave Naruto a final hug, turned and walked toward the exit of the balcony, leaving Naruto and Captain alone. Boy, these next years will either forge you or break you. I do not care if you are dying, you will succeed. With that, the man placed his helmet on. You will refer to me as Lord Captain and nothing else. Now let us be on our way. He started to walk down the steps toward the harbor, where another ship awaited them. Little did anyone know, they would create the greatest monster since the days of the first Fire Lord, one who could shift the earth and embody the sun, one that would stop at nothing to protect those close to it, and would bring the Avatar himself to ruin. It was late in the evening when a sleek mid-sized ship sailed into the harbor of the Fire Nation's capital. The ship was like an iron dragon, the bow sliced through the calm water like a knife through butter. The ship itself was a grayish-black color covered in red, radiant sun symbols speared through by a trident. On the bow sat a golden dragon, its eyes aglow with an evil crimson fire. A large, heavy gang was hefted from the ship by its grim and sullen crew. The plank landed with a hefty thunk sounding out around the quiet harbor. A huge beast pounced off of the ship, bounding down the gangplank and coming to a halt on the dock. It was a large black Shirshu, a rare beast rarely found in the Earth Nation, much less anywhere else. It was pitch black in color, with a brown stripe that went from its nose to the tip of its tail. It had no eyes, all of its senses being diverted to the mole-like nose on the end of its snout, which twitched and moved with the air currents. The beast's long tail swayed with movement as it licked around its maw with its venomous tongue. On its large furry back sat a shadowed figure. He wore a long black cloak that was lined with red. One hand was bare while the other was covered by an armored gauntlet. He wore a gray bodysuit under a black high-colored tailcoat, his shoulders covered in silver armor, and his feet wrapped in solid black boots. His head was covered by the hood of the cloak, hiding his identity. Turning back toward the ship, the figure watched as a squad of heavily armored Komodo rhino riders followed him off the ship, quickly dropping into formation around him. With a wave of his hand, they began to bound forward, their direction. The royal palace itself. 50 minutes later, the squadron stopped just before the gates of the palace, the guardians around them only ceasing their movements when they gazed upon the red suns adorned on their uniforms. The men dismounted. They moved in unison, almost like robots rather than men, moving in lockstep toward the now open palace, crossing the threshold and moving deeper within, passing both servant and guard alike. They stopped before the throne, hidden behind its usual curtain of flame. "My lord, I have returned," the young man said as he slowly began removing his hood, revealing a shock of blonde hair and a face as if sculpted out marble. "Naruto? You have become stronger. This I can see myself. However, you must prove to me how strong you are. Tomorrow there is to be an honor duel. I wish for you to fight it for me. Prove your strength." Ozai's voice was comparable to that of rolling thunder, yet it almost hissed like a viper poised to strike. Naruto held in a shiver, The man's voice had always had a cold, apathetic aspect to it, almost as if he cared little about anyone but himself, as if everyone else was his plaything to use as he wished. I would be honored to fight in your name, my liege. Good, good. Now you may be dismissed. My daughter is in the main garden, and she may wish to see you before you go to rest, the man said, finally allowing Naruto to leave the throne room and head toward the palace gardens. By the time he had crossed the palace to the gardens, the full moon was up bathing the gardens in its beautiful light. There he came across the princess in one of her usual training patterns. Her blue flames flowed with each movement in small spouts or in large gouts, mesmerizing Naruto with their sheer beauty. However, even he could see the frustration within her movements, the anger flashing up with each blast of fire. As she completed her katas, Naruto walked up behind her. You've definitely improved by leaps and bounds. Almost as much as I have, he grinned as he said this. Azula whipped around and stared at him, her eyes wide with surprise and happiness, yet even he could see the sadness held deep within. She crashed into him, breaking him out of his reverie. He held her close, though after a couple seconds she pulled away. He'd heard about the disappearance of her mother, but he hadn't known how she'd taken it or what had been said beforehand. She was restless and angry. It showed on her face, something that was recurring ever since her mother disappeared. It left Naruto at a loss. He didn't know what to do or how he could help the angered princess. He did take notice of something, however. The word monster. Something about her shifted. Even though he had mentioned it when their conversation had stumbled upon his moniker, she'd still reacted, and he'd seen it. She shrunk in on herself. The usual beepy and arrogant princess was gone. All that seemed to be left was a sad, broken girl. It seemed as if the world itself had swallowed her up and had begun to crush her. You know, just before Mother disappeared, Zuko and I had an argument. He was being a fool and was defending a small duck turtle. Puny thing, really, the runt of the litter. The little creature wouldn't have survived another week even with its mother. I had told him it was better for the beast to be put down out of its misery, she sniffled. Naruto hugged her closer to himself as she spoke. I went to push Zuko out of the way and burn it to ash instantly, but the thing bit me and Zuko laughed. So I incinerated it, completely. It felt nothing. But Zuko screamed, her fist started to clench. He could feel frustration turn to rage. He called me a monster, and that woman. The woman I called my mother called me a monster. Bright hot tears began to flow down her face. Everyone believes me to be a monster. But, she turned to him, her bright amber eyes practically aflame as she captured his own blue orbs. Do you think I'm a monster? Do you think I shouldn't have been born? Her question caught him off guard. He hadn't expected her to be so vulnerable. It took him a moment to answer. To Azula, the moment was more like an entire year. The flickers of emotion flashing across her best friend's face only made her feel more insecure. You think it too, don't you? Naruto remained silent, watching as Azula turned to face him. Her eyes red and wet. You're just like them. The servants, my friends, and my mother. You think I'm a monster? That small ember was quick to turn into a raging fire. Most would jump and duck for cover, but not Naruto. He stood tall and firm. With almost no hesitation, he grabbed her into a hug. Her previous torrent of words cut off by Naruto's firm, strong chest, Azula found herself slowly being rocked. And a low hum began to reverberate from his chest. Azula. This was the first time he had ever used such a serious tone with her, especially when they were alone. I have seen monsters. The men who left my parents in that spirit-forsaken cell was a monster. The corrupt council of that goddamn village were monsters. Those foul avatar worshippers were the worst of the worst, but you? You are not a monster. Azula burst into tears at that, as Naruto lightly hummed her to sleep within his. Just sat there, together. Next day, Naruto hadn't seen who he would be fighting. He hoped he could just end it fast and not have to deal with any backlash or drawn-out fighting. Though he hoped he could have seen Iroh before he went to engage for the Agni Kai, the man was nowhere to be seen. And it was so. After carrying the princess to her room, he had gotten a good amount of sleep in and had awoken to a decent breakfast. Now, however, he was briskly walking toward the Agni Kai Stadium. From what he could hear, it seemed everyone was already there and waiting for the challengers. He'd hoped that it would be someone good enough to garner his attention, otherwise there would be no point using all his abilities. And here he stood, just before the gates to fighting grounds themselves, his face set in a neutral stare as the gates were slowly drawn open by the two thralls on either side. He noticed his opponent was yet to arrive. Knowing to pay his patron the respects necessary, he kneeled before the Fire Lord awaiting further instructions. The man rose, and as he did so all talk within the stadium silenced. The Agni Kai between the ward of my family and my eldest son shall begin. Now, he roared the last word. Naruto felt the world around him still as the doors opposite to his position were drawn open and the skinny boy was pushed out. He could feel the Fire Lord's eyes upon him, almost pushing him to kill the boy. No, he would finish this as quickly as possible without harming the boy too much. Although he cared little for Zuko, he did not wish to kill or maim the boy accidentally. He had not deserved that yet. Naruto stood before the boy. Zuko's eyes were filled with fear, though within that fear Naruto could see hints of anger and betrayal. Naruto fell into his horse stance, his left hand behind his back while his right was held in front at an angle, signaling Zuko to charge him. No words were shared between the two as the disgraced prince kicked forward a fireball at Naruto, trying to overwhelm him in a single move. The fireball was simply pitiful, however, and Naruto batted it aside with a single swipe. Naruto blurred forward, dropping into a leg sweep, forcing Zuko to jump above the leg only to be forced back by a heavy kick to his chest, sending the boy flying back, wheezing heavily. Naruto moved toward him, intending on finishing the match quickly. The boy had not deserved anything too harsh. As your prince, I order you to cease, Zuko whispered harshly as Naruto came in close to grab his head. Naruto paused, his head tilted slightly in confusion. What was this boy trying to do? Zuko took advantage of the pause and blasted him in the face with a heavy stream of fire, getting gasps from the crowd around them as he jumped away from his opponent. Naruto simply brushed off any soot that remained on his face. It was a good attack, Naruto would give him that, but it was futile. Zuko began to grow more and more frustrated. Every attack was deflected or simply absorbed. Nothing he did mattered. He could feel the cold eyes of his father and the clear uncaringness of his sisters on him. There was no way this man that stood before him was even close to his age. Naruto's eyes held nothing. No anger, no fear, nothing. Simply a void that absorbed everything that it touched. Zuko's anger blazed. He knew this boy was looking down on him, not even seeing him as an opponent to use his fire against. Zuko roared in anger, emulating a fierce dragon, flames spewing out of his mouth. Don't you dare look down on me, you monster! Zuko's fire bathed Naruto in its heat, washing over his body and trying to turn him to ash. The blaze was so high and so hot that even Ozai himself raised an eyebrow, while those weaker that sat around the stadium covered their eyes or shielded their faces. Iroh himself was surprised and proud of the flames he'd helped his nephew to cultivate. However, the man's face was still grim. He knew what was to come. He hadn't prepared Zuko to fight someone like Naruto. The boy was a prodigy, almost as if the spirits of fire and the sun itself had given the Naruto their full power, and now it showed. The entire stadium began to heat up. Soon all but the strongest fire benders began to sweat. Zuko's eyes bulged. Azula leaned as far forward as her status would permit. Iroh's eyes narrowed as he slowly began to rise. The crowd around them began to gasp in awe and terror. The center of this all, the swirling tornado of fire and smoke, which was slowly being compressed, swirling into the palms of the barely harmed Naruto. The boy's sheer rage was evident on his face. Naruto's eyes simply glowed with the anger and fire of a vengeful god. All Zuko saw after was darkness. Naruto rushed him, the compressed ball of flame being thrown into the air, showing his prowess and control as he began pummeling the prince. Punch after punch, each blow crushing both the boy's spirit and his body. But Naruto knew better than to completely cripple the fool. However, he'd grow to fear the blonde for years to come. Naruto snatched the sun-like ball of fire out of the air, slamming it against the left half of the prince's head. The boy didn't even get a chance to scream as the ball was crushed and exploded in a long, sharp stream of fire which shaved off and erased Zuko's entire left ear and sealed his eyes shut. The now disfigured prince fell to his knees, his eyes wide with pain and fear, his mouth open and moving but simply no words leaving it. Naruto looked up at the Fire Lord, looking for the man's decision, receiving a nod to the unanswered question as the adolescent before him collapsed into the dirt. Turning away from Zuko's limp body, Naruto locked eyes with Iroh, the old father figure, giving him a look of severe disappointment, the look forcing even more regret down upon the boy's shoulder. However, it was Azula's look of triumph and even glee that made him feel different. It wasn't sadness, nor was it even happiness. It was simple apathy. He didn't care what Zuko thought of him, and while Iroh's feelings meant a lot, they were simply overshadowed by Azula. His charge, the one he protect till the end of his days and even further beyond. Later that night, Naruto was worried. The sheer silence of the night is what worried him. Usually there would be the chatter of the guards doing their rounds, the quiet whispers of maids in V3 and the odd cry of a child. Yet, there was nothing, not even the sound of the cicadas and crickets. Naruto leapt out of his bed as he heard the loud shrill scream of a maid, one which was quickly silenced by a wet snap. Naruto cursed, his senses having not picked up this would-be assassin. He jumped through his open window swinging to stand on the courtyard above his room. There he found the bodies of 4 sun guards, their faces blue and cold. He knew exactly where they were going, and he'd erase them from existence. As Naruto rushed down the corridor, he could hear the sounds of fire bending and battle taking place further down the hall. He increased his speed till he was not but a blur to those who still lived and could see him. The large double doors which led to the courtyard before the throne room were thrown open, and within the courtyard 30 of OOC's best firebenders were fighting for their lives. A team composed of both waterbenders and earth-bending mercenaries had somehow snuck into the palace, and were now rampaging toward the main rooms of the ruling family. Naruto couldn't have that happen and potentially have Azula hurt. As such he struck, flames spewing out like a river, catching 2 of the 8 benders off guard and melting their bodies to mulch. This, however, caught the attention of one of the earth benders, who tore a piece of the courtyard and tossed it at him. Naruto grinned at the man's impertinence, ripping away the control of the boulder and sending it careening back at the shell-shocked mercenary. He managed to slow it enough that it wouldn't hit him, however he didn't notice the red-hot hand punch through the boulder and his chest till it tore his heart out. The mercenary collapsed with barely a wheeze. Those guards who remained retreated to the doors leading toward the inner sanctums, while the mercenaries themselves circled Naruto wearily. Naruto slammed his hands into the ground, coating them in earth and stone. Then before his opponent's very eyes he began to superheat the rock till both hands were covered in extraordinarily hot rock, surprising and terrifying his opponents. One of the waterbenders grew impatient and rushed him, jumping in the air with a swirl of water around him, bringing it down upon Naruto's head, or at least aiming to, as Naruto's speed simply outclassed the assassin's. However, the man's sheer agility and flexibility allowed him to have a small edge against the monster that was Naruto. He weaved and bobbed around the waterbender's assault, slowly getting closer and closer to the man, who began to panic. He was caught off guard by the spike of ice that grazed his. Out of the corner of his eye he spotted the second waterbender creating ice out of the water at her side. He weaved around another water hammer and barely dodged the second barrage of icicles. He clicked his tongue in annoyance. These 2 fools were draining him ever so slowly. He sped around, creating a large tornado of fire around himself, forcing the male waterbender to back off lest he be burned alive. Naruto capitalized, flinging balls of condensed fire at the female bender, forcing her to stagger back, each parry costing her more and more of her precious water. She flung one last icicle, weakening her shield. Naruto allowed the icicle to graze his lower rib, drawing small amounts of blood. However, in response he flung a spear of condensed fire, the blaze breaking straight through the limited defense she'd put up. The fire turned her to ash at an agonizingly slow pace, her face a mask of horror and pain. Her shrieks of unending pain sent shivers up everyone's spine till she was finally silenced, her body being split in 2 cauterized halves. Kawaii, the male assassin, shouted, his voice filled with the pain of losing a loved one. Naruto's grin became savage and feral as the male assassin began to attack faster and faster, his rage blinding him to Naruto's movements. And as such he only noticed how close Naruto was to his now deceased lover when the upper half of her body came flying towards him and bowling him over. The man stared in horror at the woman's upper half that now laid splayed across his lap, the blood and ash mixing together and forming a type of ghastly gel that still spread across him, her lifeless eyes boring into his own even as Naruto appeared behind him, slowing, grasping either side of his head with his white-hot hands. "You'll be seeing her soon." And with a sickening crack the man's head was ripped off and dropped to one side. Naruto gave it an uncaring kick, annoyed by the sheer gall of these fools to even contemplate trying to get into the inner sanctums. He began to count the bodies of those he had killed and those that had been captured. His eyes narrowed. There was one missing. His eyes widened as the realization struck. They were going after the royal family. Yet the corridor it had seemed opened led to. Naruto crouched, his body coiling as if he were a snake preparing to strike. The ground cracked and broke as he bounded forward, a single leap taking him through the corridor in a blur of violent movement, his sharp turquoise eyes darting from side to side, picking up any clues to how far ahead the assassin was. He rebounded off a wall and kicked off again, cracking the solid marble wall as the doors to Azula's bedroom came into sight. The door was thrown open and Azula was fighting for her life. The female assassin was throwing everything at the teen, who responded in kind, her unique blue flames dancing around her body as she flipped and backed away from the waterbender. She was finally knocked down and was about to be speared through. The spear of water was blocked by Naruto himself, as he almost teleported between the two, piercing just above his belly button. His eyes flashed with rage as his arms reached forward to wrap around her neck. The woman's eyes widened in fear as Naruto's molten hot hands began to burn her throat without even touching her. Then he stopped. A deranged smile appeared on his face as his eyes focused on her necklace. Water Tribe. I suppose we may have use for you later. In a show of pure flexibility, he raised his foot, slamming it down into the woman's head and knocking her out. He fell to a knee. The numerous cuts on his body combined with the hole and stress of the night of fighting had drawn the fatigue, finally forcing him to rest. As he breathed in heavily, he felt a light hand lay itself on his shoulder. Then he felt the light cloth of a bandage wrap around his wounds tightly. Grunting in discomfort, he looked over his shoulder, only to his surprise to see Azula herself wrapping his injuries. I hope you're happy that a princess of my status is wrapping your injuries, she said to him, her voice holding a sort of hollow haughtiness to it. Naruto turned and smiled at her, the blood on his face doing nothing to discourage her slight blush at the action. Thank you. She could still see that something was bothering him. I'm sorry I even allowed this filth to get near you. Next time I promise to be more vigilant, he said as he looked down at the unconscious body at his foot, kicking it lightly. Azula gripped his face and turned to Naruto to face her. As long as I know you're with me, I'll fear nothing but death itself, she smiled as she said this, and Naruto's eyes widened slightly as a feeling that was almost unknown to him filled his heart. I'll tell the guards to take the body to the dungeons. I have a couple plans for her, he said as he leaned back into Azula's touch, her hands holding him tightly as the guards removed the unconscious woman. As the doors were shut, both of them fell into a light sleep, their dreams nothing but love and care for one another, and the destruction of all who stood in their way. Next day, Naruto stood in the dungeon before the woman who had tried to execute his love, his liege, and he would show her the error of her ways. The woman had her mask removed and her long brown hair had been cut short. Naruto stared down at the woman, her arctic blue eyes intense yet afraid. Naruto struck her once with a straight backhand, forcing her head to one side, bruising her eye. I am going to ask a couple questions. Every time you say something I dislike, I break something. And the more you lie to me, the worse it gets, she spat in his face, the solid clump of saliva landing directly on his cheek. It was burned away as quickly as it landed. Naruto reached down, gripping a long piece of earth that appeared just in front of his leg, and blew on it quickly, heating it up to the point where it was almost glowing. I'm going to enjoy this very much. Now try not to scream. 2 years later. It had been 2 years since the assassination attempt. 2 years since Naruto had began to drain the information from the would-be assassin. He learned many things from the woman. One of those things stretched to why he was now rampaging across villages that had just been absorbed into the Fire Kingdom. He and the men and women he led hunted down the enemy within, the enemy which had been forming revolutions and rebellions both within the Fire Kingdom and within the faltering Earth Kingdom. Ozai had deployed him less like a weapon of mass destruction, and more like a natural disaster. Where he walked, entire villages were put to the torch or simply emptied. The Earth Kingdom did try its best to counterattack, yet every assault it tried, Naruto blunted it, the sheer brutality of his attacks forcing the enemy back. We meet him at one of these intense counterattacks. Naruto spun in midair, dodging the twin boulders that were sent hurtling toward him by 2 Earthbender soldiers. Landing on his feet, his flames burst to life as he flung 2 fireballs. One slammed into an Earthbender, setting him alight immediately. However, he ignored the man's screams as he focused on the final Earthbender, the grizzled man having been able to raise up a large slab of thick rock which protected him from the initial blast. However, even with how strong the earth was, the sheer heat still almost caught the bender off guard by almost boiling the hands which held up the stone wall. Naruto jumped forward, slamming his fist into and through the stone wall, catching the man by surprise and knocking him back. Splitting the wall in half, he continued to pursue the retreating bender. He reached behind him and grabbed the hilt which rested on his back. Pulling it away revealed it to be a tetsubo, solid black steel crowned with sharpened metal spikes jutting from it. Roughly a bit longer than a forearm, the weapon was brutal yet easily wielded by the teen. He swung it once, crushing the man's kneecap and shattering his shin. The bender fell to the ground, the sheer pain and fear flooding his body, causing him to lose control of his earth bending. Naruto stood next to the man, his blue eyes staring deep into the brown of the wounded earth bender. Now, Naruto said as he kneeled down next to the crying man, The earth rose up and covered his arms and hands as Naruto kneeled down next to him. "You're going to tell me everything you know." Later, Naruto rode into the massive war camp of the Fire Nation, about 2,000 men and women. Both benders and non-benders together formed the vanguard of the massive colonial fighting force. Naruto, while not the commander of the massive force, was still one of its heroes. A monster to the earthbender, yet a hero to the firebenders. The duality of man, Naruto thought to himself as he contemplated the greetings that he was given by the Fire Nation soldiers around him. One of the Fire Nation messengers rushed up to him. Sweat poured down the man's face and arms. He had little to no hair upon his head, and Naruto could tell this was a man who rarely ever left his desk. "My lord, General Doefeng has asked for you to lead the assault on Hong, north of our position and one of the many regional capitals of the Earth Kingdom," the man began to say as Naruto nodded at his orders. "And there are letters from the Fire Lord's correspondents within your tent. We didn't look at them in pain of death," the man finished before walking away, the now noticed aide stumbling behind the rotund man. Naruto shook his head, pulling on the reins of his shushu as he began to move toward his tent. After passing many soldiers and even the staging grounds of the next invasion, Naruto came upon his tent, just a couple meters away, everything just as he'd left it earlier that day. Sitting down on his bunk, he noticed the letters that were placed there by the servant. Taking up the first one, which had the Fire Lord's signature upon it, he opened it, revealing its contents. "Naruto, my failure of a son Zuko has successfully found the Avatar, but he continues to fail me and cannot capture what should be a 113-year-old air nomad. The last time the Avatar was spotted, he was in the southern pole, a place I'm assured you are quite knowledgeable on. My advisors assure me that he is heading toward the Northern Water Tribe to gather followers. You will intercept them at the Northern Water Kingdom. And if you must raze it to the ground, capturing the Avatar is the secondary priority for you. Your main goal is to cripple the tribe. Azula will be making her way there alongside her friends. You will be secondary to her and Admiral Zhao, mostly Azula, however. Do not fail me." Naruto rolled his eyes at the obvious threat that was hidden with the letter. However, he hated the cold. He hated the snow and the water and the ice that came with it. He shivered somewhat as the memories of the cold hit him hard. Quickly opening the second letter to get rid of the memories, Naruto noticed it was written by Azula herself. He quickly opened it and began to read. To Naruto, "Father's sending me toward the Northern Water Tribe soon. We're going to take the kingdom in the name of the Fire Nation. They won't stand a chance against us, not to mention that apparently little Zuzu will be there too, seeing as he still hasn't caught the old man. Anyways, I hope my gift found you well. It's a new kanabo made from the best iron money could buy. It should have just arrived. I personally think it looks good, so make sure you look after it. I'll be seeing you soon enough, Azula." Naruto grinned at the letter. He could feel the care and feeling written into it. Even as she mocked Zuko, he could still tell that she felt some small love for her brother despite him being banished and disfigured. Looking around, he found the kanabo laying atop a small table. The weapon was a golden color, being a little longer than his original one, with the handle being crafted from gold steel alloy and wrapped in the best leather one could find. The head of the weapon was covered in blackened steel nubs, rounded off yet still brutal in its design. There was a flame-like etching across the entire broad head of the weapon. Naruto could tell that while the weapon was incredibly expensive, it was truly masterfully built. Underneath the glorious weapon sat a piece of clothing. Lifting it up, Naruto realized that it was a beautifully tailored red and white haori. On the back sat the symbol of the Fire Nation, as well as a blue flame representing his link to the Crown Princess. Naruto smiled bashfully as he put the haori on and saw how well it fit. Taking it off, he then placed it back onto the table, trying to get some sleep before the great siege. 3 hours later, Naruto woke up to shouting and sounds of mobilization. Getting up slowly, he was greeted to the sight of an army private kneeling by his tent flap. "What is it, Private?" Naruto asked the small wiry man. "Sir, I was sent here by the general. The assault is to begin within half an hour. He wishes for you to be in position as soon as possible," the scrawny man said before quickly disappearing back into the streams of soldiers rushing about. Naruto nodded to himself and began to get dressed, placing the haori on last and strapping the kanabo to his back. Naruto admired himself in the mirror, trying his best to comb the spikes out of his hair, yet gave up after a couple minutes. Quickly rushing out of his tent, Naruto was greeted by the sight of a couple hundred tundra tanks as well as a couple thousand soldiers all milling about, and preparing armor and weaponry while others were eating a final meal before the movements. Naruto himself walked toward one of the lead tanks. Most of the engineers and benders that made up the crew of the tanks bowed as he walked past. Naruto never understood why, but many of the benders and Fire Nation soldiers especially respected him, whether out of fear or out of admiration. He was happy to be their role model, and he felt good to be accepted by a higher number of people than those who were his friends. Hopping onto his tank, he realized that the vehicle had been modified somewhat. The usual vision and firing ports had been made wider, allowing for better visibility and easier use of his more volatile techniques. Seeing him look over his vehicle, one of the engineers came up towards him, a short yet stocky man with cleanly shaven face and dark blue eyes. "My name is Sasuke," the man said as he shook Naruto's hand with a firm grip. "I'll be one of your engineers and driver for the Lady Azula." Naruto quirked an eyebrow at the name. He wasn't sure how Azula would take someone naming a tank after her, but he was sure her pride would allow her to accept it. "Where did the name come from?" Naruto asked. Well, when we knew that you were going to be a part of the crew, we decided to name her that and give her a couple upgrades suitable of your bending. I hope they're up to your standards." Naruto nodded. "It's a pretty good-looking beast, though I suppose we should probably get in and get ready to move out," Naruto responded as the engineer nodded, and they both began to make their way toward the vehicle, where they met the last of their crew, a young female firebender, as denoted by her uniform and light armor. The woman nodded to Sasuke but turned to Naruto and practically gushed over meeting her apparent idol. "I'm so happy I got to meet you, sir. You're a big inspiration. Despite being attacked and protecting the princess from those rebel scum, you're here fighting alongside us rather than being holed up in the palace." The woman's long tirade of words came to an end as she finally realized something. "Oh, I'm such an idiot, I forgot to tell you what my name is. I'm Sunam. I'll be your secondary gunner and engineer," she said with a bright smile on her face as she quickly grabbed Naruto's hand. Distantly, Naruto felt as if Azula had felt the disturbance and was now setting fire to everything in her vicinity. But he would never know how true that actually was and probably wouldn't want to know. Just as Sunam was about to continue talking, the war horns began to blare out across the camp. Sunam looked around slightly confused but quickly began to get into her tank as she saw Sasuke do the same, Naruto jumping in last, nodding to Sasuke as the tank began to start up, just like those around them. The steam engines powering up and turrets began to move as the entire tank force and infantry force prepared to move. Naruto stood in the cupola of the tank, watching as the other tank commanders began to give the go-ahead. General Doifeng stood to his left on a raised platform, the man's old, wizened features losing none of their zeal or power. With a single nod, he let slip the hounds of war. Naruto gave the hand signal, and the tanks began to move. The full armored division began to move forward at speed, the heavy armor cutting its way through the forest supported by the infantry and archers of the Fire Nation's best. After a couple hours, the armored fist came to a stop at the base of the large hill which formed the bottom of the city of Hong, a major regional capital within the northern sections of the Earth Kingdom. Naruto and his tank began the assault, the armored vehicle pulling itself up the sheer cliff, the hooked treads digging into the stone and earth and pulling itself up. Behind, the rest of the armored division followed suit, moving like armored snakes on the hillside. Alarms began to sound all across the city. The unprepared defenders rushed toward their posts, some half-dressed and others without armor, most even without their hair done up. The general of the fortress city himself came out half-dressed, the man's shirt barely on, as his men began to throw large boulders from the battlements, hurriedly launching them toward the oncoming horde of Fire Nation tanks. Naruto sat forward on the cupola, breathing deeply as the boulders began to fall toward his vanguard. Whipping his hand around, Naruto sent a long, thin stream of molten fire splitting the cascade of boulders in half. Then he began to build flames within his chest, puffing it out to resemble that of a proud pea-beep. Flames began to escape from his nose and the corners of his mouth as he continued to breathe in. Finally getting to his stalling point, he breathed out a deluge of white-hot fire. The blaze pushed itself up and over the walls, catching any who weren't prepared off guard and simply erasing their existence. Those who weren't directly at the edge suffered immediate third-degree burns, sending them into shock and forcing whatever medics that remained to jump into action promptly. Even as reinforcements dashed toward the parapets, however, it was simply too late. Naruto's armored divisions had either punched their way through the wall, or had simply scaled it, and were now pouring over the sides. Some Tundra tanks were sent back over by any earthbenders who could rally themselves against their foe, however those were quickly dealt with by any benders or archers that could keep their wits about them. Sanaka, keep us moving forwards, don't stop at all. Tsunami, when I say so, take my position on the tank. Naruto called back to his crew. The older man nodded and continued to pull on the levers that kept the tank moving, crushing two earthbenders beneath its metallic bulk. Will do, sir, Tsunami called back to him, her sweet voice slightly drowned out by the sounds of the engine and battle. Nodding, Naruto watched as two more of his tundra tanks made their way over the tops of the wall, crushing the basic earthworks the earthbenders had constructed. Behind the tanks, a couple soldiers clambered up, obviously using the scaling ropes they had tied to the back of the armored vehicles. He signaled to Tsunami, letting her know that it was now time for her to take his position. Despite her obvious confusion, she knew better than to question the monster of Fire Nation. And as such, as he leapt from the tank's open hatch, spinning like some demented spinning top, Tsunami took his position, continuing to fire smaller fireballs from the spinning turret. Naruto himself ran across the parapet, weaving between benders and slamming his kanabo into others, crushing key body parts. The golden weapon flashed in the midday sun as Naruto swung it deftly, the weapon itself a tool of destruction, carving through the enemies like a scythe through chaff. The earthbenders began to fall back at the intensity of the assault. Those that could hold their position tried but were forced back by Naruto's unending assault. Flames and the heavy swings of kanabo kept the earthbenders from approaching too close, as well as sneaky uses of earth bending to loosen the earth around him gave the duel user an immediate edge. The earthbenders and Earth Kingdom soldiers were forced back from the walls, the Fire Nation soldiers pouring through the breaks like water through a river. Street-to-street battles began to break out as civilians tried to rush toward the center of the city. The stampede caused by them interrupted the defense of the earthbenders and simply allowed the firebenders to push forward. Undaunted and unfazed, turning toward the second in command of the fighting force, Naruto began to order. "I'm taking 2 men with me to secure up the eastern flank and force the enemies back. Make sure that the enemy does not stall us here. Do not disappoint me, Commander." The man began to sweat but nodded and agreed to his orders. Naruto signaled to the 2 Imperial firebenders behind them, and the 3 leapt from the walls down into the streets below, rushing through the streets, 2 firebenders beside him as he headed toward the earthbender counterattack. The assault had been going roughly to plan. Most of the earthbender redoubts within the city had fallen or were in the process of being attacked and pushed out. He focused his mind as he and his men came across the remnants of the fire soldier rearguard engaging the bulk of the enemy forces. The firebenders and non-benders desperately clashed with the earthbenders and earth militia, the green-colored tide forcing the soldiers back step after step. Those elite firebenders that fought could only do so much, especially against the earthbenders and the masses of militia. The earthbenders simply tore up the earth, shielding whatever forces they could from the powerful benders. Naruto and his 2 firebender allies attacked from the rear, much to the shock of the earthbenders. None of them were aware of the 3 benders behind them until it was too late. Naruto and the twin benders struck against the group, Naruto himself the first to engage. With a single gesture of his hand, a wave of liquidized fire sprung from the limb, setting those closest to him alight quickly. The Imperial benders snapped out of their silent awe and began to rain fireballs down on the earthbenders, whom upon being attacked scattered as if they were bee approaches. The earthbenders spun around, few being quick enough to throw up large earth barriers while others were incinerated too quickly to put up a fight. Those earthen barriers that did stand against the flames didn't stand against Naruto's superior earth bending. With a single stamp, the walls and barriers the earthbenders had produced crumbled into naught but dust before their eyes, leaving them open to the lances of fire that followed up, turning their bodies to ash. The earth militia stood no chance against the brutality that both sides showed as they pincered their enemy. The remaining Fire Nation rearguard pounced upon their now defanged enemy, tearing those that didn't run into chunks while burning those that tried to run to a crisp. Naruto turned to the commander of the rearguard, a tall, stern-looking man who, despite being wounded, still held the apparent respect of his men. Naruto approached him, looking down into the tall man's face. "What's your name, soldier?" The man looked back up at Naruto. "My name is Sarvitz, my lord, Lieutenant First Class of the 4th Division. Where is the commander of the Eastern Strike Force?" "He's meant to be ensuring that things like this do not happen," Naruto asked. His eyes narrowed slightly. The lieutenant shrugged as best as he could. "I do not know. We were simply sent here to reinforce the lines and ensure things like this didn't happen. We didn't expect such a large force to surprise us like that." "Well, Major, you've done a good job here. Make sure to get yourself to the rear of the lines and healed up in time for our victory." The man's head quickly snapped up at those words. Major? But by the time the man had asked, Naruto had already disappeared, the twin benders following suit. Shrugging, he continued his orders, knowing it was better to follow the orders of a monster rather than a fool. Naruto continued down the street, kanabo in hand, a cold grim look struck across his face. He walked past the bodies of both firebenders and earthbenders. The firebenders he passed, he made sure to take their identifications so they could be buried. However, any earthbenders that he came across were left to rot. As he made his way through the streets, Naruto came across an injured earthbender. The man's stomach had been torn open, and he was breathing heavily. Naruto gripped the dying bender by his throat, his sheer anger at most if not all earthbenders flowing through as he began to heat up his hand. Where is your general? Where is the governor general of this city? The man simply shrugged at Naruto's questions, spitting on his boots. Naruto rolled his eyes. Well, you're useless to me, it seems, he said as he dropped the earthbender, forcing a loud groan from the man. Walking past him, he continued down the street. After about half an hour of walking, the street ended in a large brown citadel. The pallid brown walls were cracked and scorched yet still held firm. Within, Naruto could see about 200 earthbenders and non-benders, as well as the countless civilians he could feel beneath the towering fortress. From what he could feel, this citadel was either the last or one of the last redoubts left within the city. Everything else had been scoured, and as such the tundra tank divisions began to surround the fortress, some with ballistae while others had the simpler fire-bending turret. Though all movement stopped when Naruto and his two bodyguards arrived on the scene. Moving through the heavy fighting vehicles and soldiers, Naruto came to a halt where he knew the entrance to the fortress was. Waiting for a bit, he finally called up to the defenders on the walls. Earthbender General, whoever you are, you've got two options. One is to fight me, and if you win you will regain your city and you can kill me. The second is that you will surrender, and all the men of fighting age will be sent to the Boiling Rock prison and other such labor camps. What is your choice? Naruto didn't react when he felt the vibrations of the man's movements through the fortress. From what he could feel, the man was quite physically imposing, tall and bulky, yet this meant that he was slow and clumsy in his movements. But he wouldn't underestimate the large man, not when so much was on the line. Finally, a large stone door collapsed, revealing a long dark tunnel, where the massive general stalked out. The man was easily almost 7 feet tall and wore thick Earth Kingdom armor. Each sheet of metal was thick and covered large portions of his body. The only part uncovered was his head. A thick bristled beard hung off the man's face, and a short, squat helmet sat on top of his head, covering the top half of his face. I am General Hudongja, Lord of the region of Hong and commander of this garrison. I shall fight you, and I shall defeat and kill you, bringing your head before the feet of the glorious Earth King. The man's voice was similar to his bending, dull and similar to that of grinding rocks. Naruto rolled his eyes at the man's bravado, knowing full well that the Earth General would never see the light of day again. If you'd stop blabbering so we could get on with it, I'd be incredibly happy. The man growled in anger, drawing a large warhammer from behind him and summoning a large shield made from the earth itself. Naruto grinned at the general, hefting his large kanabo. The older man moved first, showing some speed as he made a quick charge toward the younger boy. Naruto quickly rolled out of the way, responding with a quick yet devastating back strike which shattered the back of the man's cuirass. Naruto grinned cheekily at the earthbender. However, the grin hid something completely malicious. The earthbender kicked out at Naruto, sending a long pillar of earth towards the boy, only for him to weave around the pillar. Stepping into Hudong's guard, he turned earth around the man's central foot into loose gravel, causing him to lose his footing and stumble backward. Naruto easily took advantage of this, swinging his kanabo toward the arm holding the hammer. Naruto's kanabo shattered the general's elbow. Hudong roared in anger as his arm fell limply to one side. Quickly backhanding Naruto, he jumped away to gain even more space. Reaching out, the earth began to drag the hammer back toward the general's good hand. Naruto would not let that happen, however. Leaping high into the air, he began to spew out a large stream of fire. The general responded by raising a large shield of earth. However, he underestimated the sheer potency of the flames which erupted from the teen. Globs of fire boiled through the earth and landed on General Hudong's armor, scorching it and sealing it against his skin, once again getting a scream of pure anguish from the man. He stayed knelt for a handful of minutes as Naruto approached him, kanabo dragging against the ground. Breathing heavily, the man looked up into the smiling face of Naruto. Do you yield? He heaved in some air. Are a monster. May the whore who sired you burn in hell. And may that woman that you serve be banished to the depths of the spirit realm. Naruto's smile disappeared at that, his annoyance clearly visible at the words of the earthbender. How dare this earthbender speak in such a way, Naruto thought to himself, his anger boiling over. Shame you didn't take the first option. Naruto gripped the larger man's shoulder tightly, his almost monstrous strength almost crushing the bone to dust. Bring out the civilians and send them to the camps. All of them. The general tried to stand, yet he was too weak, his knees giving way as he tried to scramble to his feet. Naruto turned away from the still living general, looking at one of the Imperial Firebenders. Ensure that the general sees everything. Do not kill him. Now I have a warship to catch and a city to burn. The man saluted as Naruto began to walk back toward his tank, a happy waving tsunami leaning from the inside. Four massive battleships sliced through the iceberg-filled seas, their massive black bows simply cutting through any iceberg that they hit. Four massive plumes of soot and ash filled the air behind them as they continued to push forward. Their decks bristled with weaponry, ranging from catapults to large ballistae lining the deck. Behind the large battle fleet sat the rest of the ships within the fleet. These ranged from transport and cargo ships to smaller destroyers and picket ships. These sailed quickly and the crew were on battle stations, simply because waterbenders had appeared before and only the skills of the crew had ensured that these benders could not abuse their abilities in the ocean. Well, that and the fact that the monster himself was present. Naruto stood at the bow of the leading battleship, Fire Lord's Fist. His haori flowed lightly in the wind as it continued to sail forwards. A slight chill went through his body and he cursed lightly, knowing what that meant. We're getting closer to the north. He thought to himself, there was a slight possibility that he would meet Azula and even Zuko within the icy citadel. He really couldn't wait. It was then, as he began to move back toward his room, that one of the officers caught his eye. The man seemed to be waiting for him. Naruto moved over to him, knowing he had either had a message for him or was allowing him to prepare for some sort of maneuver. The man saluted as Naruto approached, the large teen staring the man in the eyes. What is it, Commander? He asked, his voice seemingly snapping the man out of some sort of thought. Sir, we're roughly an hour and a half from the staging area. The captain has asked that you prepare yourself for any raiders that may be patrolling the route. You're the strongest one here, and while we could defeat most non-waterbender forces, the waterbenders in the north are unusually strong, much more so than their southern cousins. Naruto nodded. I've already prepared myself for anything that could happen. He placed a hand lightly on the shoulder of the commander, giving the man a reassuring smile. Nothing will happen to the fleet. It seemed he spoke too soon. More and more icebergs began to appear within the seas in front of the battleships. These began to separate the warships from the rest of the fleet, the large blocks of ice slowing down the lesser ships due to their less than ideal ice-breaking ability. Soon a thick mist began to flow in, blanketing the area around the fleet before finally rolling in and covering everything, blinding the crews from the views around them. Naruto's senses began to go off, wildly alerting him to the fast-moving projectiles off the starboard side. 13. Naruto began to smile. All men to their battle stations. 13 targets port side. One of the watchmen cried out, his voice finally filtering down to the rest of the crew, who began to scurry around to their war stations. Naruto slowly turned around, not seeing much, bar the mist and the edge of the ship. However, the sea around the ship began to churn, first slowly bubbling and low swishing as if in a small swell, then it began to buck and kick as if it were a wild stallion being saddled. Naruto practically dug his feet into the metal of the deck as the first large wave broke over the decks of the ship. Naruto unclipped the kanabo from his back, swinging it around and slamming it into the deck in front of him. The large spikes sticking from its top anchored him in place. The commander wasn't so lucky, however, and he was quickly swept from his feet. The water was ice cold. That wasn't good. Naruto began to breathe heavily, in then out, each breath creating more and more steam. In, out, in, out. Soon smoke began to rise from his nostrils, thick black smoke as his breaths got deeper. By now a second wave had struck the central ship. Any firebenders who could fight were on the deck prepared for their enemy, and so they came. 13 robed and armored waterbenders ascended onto the ship, driven forward by a large rogue wave. The first of the 13 landed amongst a group of firebenders, bending the water around him into a large circular saw. This was sent spinning toward the bridge of the flagship, intending to cripple the ship and then pick off the crew. Just as the saw was about to touch the bridge, an intense gout of fire burned it away, the stream practically burning away any mist that it touched. The waterbender turned to where the stream came from as his compatriots engaged the firebenders around him. The stream had come from Naruto himself. The monster had smoke rising from his mouth and nostrils, and the very steel he walked upon was hot as his ambient body temperature was increased by his intense bending ability. He truly looked the part of a monster. However, the waterbender was truly fearless as he moved to engage the dual bender. Naruto swung first as he approached quickly. The waterbender slid beneath the first swing, taking the opportunity to respond with a heavy hammer of water, slamming into his chest and stomach and forcing him back slightly. However, Naruto responded in kind, kicking out with a superheated foot and almost scorching the entire right side of the waterbender. The man grunted in pain and then tried to close the distance with the firebender, hoping that his apparent superior hand-to-hand skills would carry the day. He was foolish, closing the distance once again with the monstrous bender he attacked. Striking out with a palm thrust, Naruto dropped the kanabo. Leaning around the palm strike, he responded with a heavy fist. The waterbender just managed to duck under the strike. He kicked out, the kick slamming into the side of the firebender. Naruto grunted at the heavy action. Responding in kind, Naruto struck him with a back fist, grinning savagely as the bender was flung away at the action. Around them, the elite waterbenders were slowly being pushed back by the larger numbers of firebenders. Naruto paid this no mind, however, as he charged the waterbender once again. A vicious sneer splayed across his face. He threw a quick right cross, and the bender stepped back, avoiding the blow. However, he played into the feint as Naruto spun, using the momentum of the punch to throw himself into a spinning back kick, striking the solar plexus, forcing the bender in two. Naruto followed the chain with an uppercut, landing the combo and forcing the bender back. The man cursed, then growled at Naruto, lifting his arms as the seas responded to his gestures. The warship began to buckle and twist, the seas becoming more and more untenable. Two large tendrils of water flowed up behind him, akin to tentacles from a raging kraken. "You have a kraken. I have a dragon." The waterbender threw his arms forward, sending an enormous jet of water forward towards the firebender. Naruto responded in kind, exhaling and releasing a jet of purifying flame. The flames burned through the stream of water, practically turning it to steam immediately. However, it didn't stop there. The waterbender had no time to react as the jet of flame washed over his left side. There was no scream nor any cries of pain. The man slumped down, falling to his knees. His entire upper left half had been vaporized. No sound escaped from the man's covered head as Naruto approached him. He lifted his foot and kicked the dying man from the deck into the sea, knowing that by the time he'd hit the water he would be dead. Naruto looked over his shoulder. Seeing that the waterbender ambush force had been either killed or forced away, he fired off a fireball into the sky above them, acting as a signal flare through the mist. And after a couple of moments, the mist started to thin as more and more flares went off, signifying the fleet was relatively still intact. "General Naruto." Naruto turned to the feminine voice that had called out to him, coming face to face with the female first officer. The woman was tall and had a singular eye, the other covered by a black sewed eye patch. On her shoulder sat a small animal. It was small and furry, yet it had large ears and a bushy tail. "I'm First Officer Hinata. I was told to tell you that we are under an hour away from the Northern Water Tribe, and once we arrive we will be one of the main tips for the siege breaker," the woman said to him as he nodded at her words. "Tell the captain to have a platform ready at the bow of the ship." He paused as she saluted and was about to turn away before he remembered something. "Oh, and tell the captain to ask if Lady Azula is going to be at the siege." The second half of the request was said in a different and lower tone than the first. The woman nodded, storing the thoughts that she had away. The battleship lurched as it began moving once again. Black smog turned the sky dark with ash. 1 hour later, the battle group finally arrived. And before them was the entirety of the Fire Nation's northern fleet. 60 battleships and an even larger number of picket ships sat in the bay facing toward the city. The city was protected from the ships by a massive curtain wall which towered over even the largest of warships. The city behind was beautifully formed from ice and wedged between two massive glaciers. Smoke rose from the city as the large siege ships continued to launch burning trebuchet rounds over the walls. However, the large presence of waterbenders ensured no flames got out of hand, and the waterbenders responded in kind, launching their attacks in response. Most fell short, and others just ricocheted off the armored hulls of the behemoths. The warship Naruto was stationed upon continued to slip its way through the fleet, weaving between the battleships like some iron-skinned shark. The warship came alongside another battleship, this one dwarfing Naruto's by a decent margin, Gold lined the bow and aft of the ship, framing its night black hull. However, the ship was by no means undefended, bristling with all manner of weaponry ranging from catapults to ballistas and flamethrowers. Naruto stood on the bow of his battleship as the crews began to link the two ships. He took a look at the mast, knowing it would hold the flag of the fleet commander. He groaned in annoyance at seeing the crescent flame. He knew this commander well. The man wouldn't shut up. That same man was standing on the deck of the ship as his sailors lowered the gangplanks. The officers of Naruto's ship saluted the man as he held an arrogant smirk on his face which almost slipped at seeing Naruto. "Ah, finally the Crown's attack dog has arrived. I've been expecting you for a while now. However, as much as I'd like to chat, we have a siege to begin." The man turned away and began to walk away toward the bridge of the warship. "Oh, I be fed, I'll begin the siege of you, seeing as your warships can't break through a simple wall," Naruto called after the man, getting him to turn around in anger, sparks flickering off his skin. "How dare a mere dog refer to me in such a way? Do you know who I am, mongrel? I am the great Admiral Joe, right fist of the Fire Lord himself." At this point, black smoke had been exiting the older man's mouth and nose, his anger visible. Naruto simply stared at him, eyes narrowed, a small smirk spread across his face at seeing the Admiral lose his composure. Naruto turned away, ignoring the now fuming man. He looked up, seeing that the sun was now at its highest point. Naruto knew he and his firebenders would be at their strongest. "Tell all ships to have their strongest benders at their bows and prepare to launch on my order." The officer who he directed the order to saluted and ran toward the communication station. Admiral Zhao continued to stare at the back of the bodyguard, unsure of what he wanted to do. Naruto moved to the bow of the large battleship, placing his kanabo to one side and taking off his haori and throwing it to one of the sailors. He stood, revealing his scarred yet muscular upper body. He began to breathe. His bender, while not as powerful due to the cold and ice around them, he knew it would be just strong enough combined. Flames ignited on his hands, rising from his. The flames seemed to swirl and rise as if they were akin to water. He stood with his palms up, almost as if he were praying. A voice spoke to him, an arcane and ancient voice which seemed to send his blood boiling. Yet it was comforting all the same. "Listen to me, child. The Avatar is within those walls. If you wish to protect that woman, you must kill him. I know this, yet I know not what you are nor how you are doing this." He thought back to the voice which hummed in agreement, then it responded. "All you need to know for now is that I am the torch-bearer, and I shall bestow upon you a gift." Naruto felt the flames which now wrapped around his upper body increase in intensity. Around other powerful benders also felt their inner cores strengthen, their bodies overall becoming stronger as the sun rose to its highest point. None knew it was a spirit boosting their ability. "With the strength you have, you can bring down that wall. Use those around you to help you. But remember, you must kill the Avatar. His reincarnates have done wrong to not only you but to myself as well." Naruto nodded. He slowly began to go through the katas, his movements fierce and strong. His eyes glowed as if they were alight with blue flame. Around him other fire-benders caught on to his movements. They began to follow, flames building around each of the benders, which then began to quickly move toward where Naruto was gathering the flames. The flames in question formed a large ring around his midsection. More and more flames coalesced within the ring, forcing it to glow brighter and brighter. Finishing the final move, he twisted, kicking out with his right foot. The ring of flame disconnected, snaking its way along his outstretched foot at such a high speed that it was almost a blur, unseen to most. The burst of super-hot flames sped towards the center of the wall. The water benders who'd by now rushed up to the wall were hurriedly making preparations. The weaker ones summoned smaller walls of water, while the strongest of them began to lift enormous slabs of ice, positioning them between the blast and the main wall. This did nothing. The blast took the form of a screeching phoenix as it slammed through the extra defenses, the secondary walls doing nothing as the sheer heat and velocity of the fire blast cut through them like a hot knife through butter. Then it exploded within the walls. Aang had seen the firebender warships outside the walls. Even as he was hunting for a waterbender master, he knew that the firebenders would soon be upon them. Though with the way the waterbenders had prepared, he thought they would have lasted at least till nightfall. That was the hope. However, now Aang and Katara were within one of the main towers fighting off Zuko, the former prince of the Fire Nation. The team was powerful, but the combined effects of both Katara's waterbending and Aang's airbending had managed to freeze the burned prince in place. Then the hair on their arms rose. Zuko started to shiver, not because of the cold but because of fear. "He's here. He shouldn't be here." The team continued to whisper. "Who's here?" Aang asked, perplexed. Yet there was no answer. As he was about to approach the prince, it happened. A bright flash, then a loud earth-rumbling bang. Aang looked over to where the sound and flash had occurred, and sheer horror overtook his facial expression. The enormous wall which protected the tribe had buckled, the center had been pushed upwards before tumbling down as it collapsed. Any man who stayed on the wall was dead, either evaporated by the blast or simply crushed by the collapsing wall. The edges of the wall had just about remained standing, but there was a gaping maw within the center of the wall, enough for multiple battleships to dock, and now Aang realized. The Fire Nation had begun offloading troops. He had to help. Somehow, with Naruto, the flames which had covered the older team finally evaporated, revealing slight black marks which ran across his arms to his fingertips. The duel bender was tired, incredibly so. Falling to his knees, he watched as the Fire Nation soldiers swamped through the now open gap in the wall. Other benders burned holes through the wall in other sections, allowing flanking actions. Naruto took deep breaths, looking over his hands and tracing the ash-black markings. What are these markings? Why have they appeared? Is this your doing, spirit? Yes, these markings show that you are our champion. The spirit in question responded. Naruto tilted his head slightly. Our? He thought back to the spirit, yet the spirit remained silent. Naruto picked up his Haori and Kanabo, moving back toward the ship's barracks. Awaken me in 2 hours, he told one of the sailors who stood at attention, and the woman saluted in response. Naruto knew the siege would last well into the day and night, especially if the Avatar was there. He would ensure that he was fit enough to fight any that came for him. 2 hours later, Naruto walked out of his room. The nap he'd taken had done wonders to his early fatigue. He looked out over the deck to see the catapults still firing into the city. However, it seemed that the Fire Nation troops had established a foothold within the city, and were slowly pushing the defenders back. It seemed the Avatar hadn't made an appearance yet, but Naruto knew they had to take the city before the full moon came up. That alone would give the waterbenders enough strength to overwhelm the offense. Naruto called over one of the line officers. Get me a boat, I wish to go in with the next wave. The man paused for a moment, turning back to Naruto and getting a raised eyebrow in return. Sir, Admiral Zhao has ordered you to stay aboard the Redemption, in case of attack, the man said as sweat began to lightly prickle his face. Naruto's stare seemed to burn straight through him. It is a good thing I don't care for Admiral Zhao's orders then, isn't it? Now get me a boat. I wish to see how the advance is going. The man was struck into action at these words, quickly running off out of fear and duty. Within 15 minutes Naruto had been shipped off, going in with hundreds of other ships. It seemed that he would be a part of the fourth wave. The men who were going in alongside him looked at the hand of the Fire Lord in awe, knowing full well the sheer destruction and power that the teen held. Naruto looked around as the ships came ashore, landing within the gap of the wall that he had created. The men disembarked around him and with the shouts of officers began to make their way into the city, prepared to relieve those who were still on the front lines. Naruto followed a battalion as it snaked its way through the city, the veteran battalion making good time to where the fighting was thickest. After a handful of minutes, they came to a massive central plaza which led toward the main capital building, a large tower which stood firm and tall against the buildings around it. In front of the building, the heaviest defenders stood, hundreds of veteran waterbenders and non-benders, each a master of 100 battles. Before them stood hundreds of firebenders, each competent a fighter, and some even veterans of the Earth Kingdom campaigns. The firebenders attacked first, launching large balls of flame and streams of the flames at the waterbenders, who responded in kind, launching back large flows of water and ice blocks and spikes. The non-benders charged each other with swords, spears, and all manner of other weapons were used in the hand-to-hand fighting as they engaged each other, hacking and slashing with reckless abandon. The firebenders joined the growing melee, launching small bursts of fire with each strike. Naruto munched on a pawpaw as he watched the battle rage, knowing that at any point he would have to get involved. This time came when more waterbenders attacked from one of the side streets, throwing large spikes of ice that cut straight through the offensive line which had been set up by the firebenders. Those same benders responded in kind, throwing back walls of flame which almost caught the waterbenders off guard. However, it was not the sudden response of the firebenders which put off the water tribe's counterattack. It was the sudden appearance of a tall teen within the center of the waterbender defense. He stood upon the back of two men, both dead from the force of his landing. In one hand he held a large green fruit, and in the other a large golden kanabo. The shock wore on for a couple of moments before a non-bender charged the man. He was quickly struck aside with a single blow from the kanabo. Two waterbenders then charged him, aiming to kill him with twin blows from snaking water pythons. Naruto dodged the initial blows before igniting the fruit he held in his hand and chucking it at the waterbender on the left. The lit fruit struck the man clean, almost tearing his body from his head. Naruto then rushed the other waterbender, catching her by surprise as his hand ignited, grabbing her face and burning it to ash. The other benders had already started cheering and jeering their enemies as the Fire Nation soldiers surged forwards, knowing victory was within their grasp. Then a bright light flooded the area, bathing them all in a soft glow. Naruto cursed. The waterbenders in front of his forces grinned as larger pythons and tentacles of water appeared behind them. They pounced. Waterbenders began to tear through the firebender offensive as the moon augmented their abilities, creating razor-sharp tentacles and enormous pillars of heavy water slamming through the front lines and forcing the benders back. Naruto himself had to stabilize the line. His more extreme and powerful version of fire bending, even weakened slightly by the cold, still managed to hold off the waterbenders' powerful attacks. He turned an entire squad to ash as more still came. Those firebenders that were still alive were pinned down within the plaza as they fought desperately to hold off the ensuing assault. Naruto stood at the forefront with his kanabo and bending, cutting down multiple waterbenders and non-benders. Just as the benders were about to try to overwhelm Naruto's position, the battlefield was suddenly bathed in a red glow. She is dead. This does not ruin much, however. A balance must be maintained. The half-breed shall fulfill her duty. Naruto didn't question what the torchbearer meant by that comment. He was more focused on the fact that the waterbenders could no longer throw ice or water spears at them. For the Fire Lord, Naruto roared as he charged from behind cover, slinging globs of molten fire at hapless defenders, two of which were caught off guard and had their torsos burned away. The other Fire Nation soldiers followed behind, shouting their oaths to the Fire Lord. With the moon red and the waterbenders lacking their ability, the firebenders began to quickly overwhelm the defenses. Both non-benders and benders alike surrendered as Naruto led the large battalions toward the Capitol building, slaughtering any who refused to surrender and arresting those who did surrender. Then, as if the tide itself changed, a bright blue glow began to stretch from a valley behind the tower. The torchbearer within Naruto's mind began to growl and sneer in anger at the power it felt. That power! It is him, no doubt, yet he has bonded with the ocean spirit. Child, do you wish to win over this kingdom? Do you wish to humble the Avatar? The spirit hissed into his mind. Naruto withheld his answer for a moment. For before him stood an enormous being made from blue water. The amount of spiritual energy which radiated from its body seemed to send every sense haywire. The Water Tribe members who still lived bowed before the beast, basking in its glory. Those of the Fire Nation began to attack it, throwing everything they could. Trebuchets, fire blasts, and other weaponry seemingly bounced off the monster. It swung its arms, washing away hundreds of troops in a single swipe. How can we defeat such a being? How can one defeat something so powerful? The torchbearer seemed to laugh, a loud booming sound which reverberated throughout Naruto's skull. Do not underestimate one such as I, child. I am a being descended from the sun itself. Now, do you wish to stop him? The torchbearer's voice seemed to speak softly, knowing his choice would be cemented within the history of the world. Naruto stood silent as the spirit continued to rampage through the city, wiping away many of the Fire Nation's contamination. One of the soldiers ran up to Naruto. The man was seemingly soaked and his expression fearful. Sir, the commanders are calling a general retreat. We cannot continue the assault with that thing defending the citadel. Naruto said nothing. Then his marks burst into flames, his body slowly being engulfed in a pyre that grew quickly, bathing the entire night in its wicked glow. As the bonfire began to grow, a burst of loud laughter could be heard. Ah ha ha ha! The fire grew bigger and bigger till it was almost the same height as the ocean spirit itself. Within the flames, a massive burnt and charred ram's skull appeared. The flames seemed to curl around it, and within it, situating it above the mass of writhing flame, twin sparks of blue formed within the eye holes of the charred skull. The chilling sparks of intelligence. The being's mere presence seemed to invigorate the firebenders, who stood in awe at its appearance. Be not afraid, my children, I the torchbearer am with you. Begone, ocean spirit, or I shall eradicate those who serve you. The spirit seemed to contemplate this thought. However, it was given no time to think as it was struck with a heavy blow. An enormous furnace of flames struck the ocean spirit's corporeal form, forcing it back against one of the large glaciers. The sheer volume and power of the torchbearer, as he seemed to melt the ice around him, burning away any waterbender filth with it, he stretched out one massive clawed hand, slamming it into the ocean spirit torso. The spirit tried to respond, sending almost a tsunami's worth of water at him. The torchbearer simply evaporated a section of the tsunami with little to no damage being done to its massive body. Avatar, no fear. My champion shall eradicate your line. The torchbearer gripped the ocean spirit's avatar tighter, its flaming hand seeming to glow with an unholy light. The ocean spirit began to dissipate, falling apart as the spirit itself could not maintain the grasp on its form, and the avatar fell with it. His body fell out of the avatar state as he did so, landing gracefully on one of the ice pylons. Fear gripped his entire body as he stared at the torchbearer. Why have you done this? Why are you helping them? Aang asked, his voice slightly shaky from the experience. The torchbearer said nothing. The blue flames which formed its eyes simply stared at him. Then it began to shrink, becoming smaller and smaller until it showed Naruto's body once again. However, the flames which curled around his body did not dissipate. They seemed to comfort him, lightly wrapping around his arms and upper body. I serve the Fire Nation. I serve them because they were there. Where were you when those earth-benders hunted my family to extinction? That's right, you were hidden. This world does not need you. Naruto stated to the avatar, his voice barely wavering. Then he moved, arriving next to Aang, who was only able to cover himself as a punch rocketed into his stomach, burning him and sending him flying. Naruto rushed after him, swinging his kanabo wildly as the burned and hurt avatar weaved around his strikes. The boy's natural agility saved him from the ferocious wild blows. Aang responded to the brutal swings with a push of air. This forced Naruto back somewhat, giving the avatar some limited breathing room. However, this was for naught as Naruto was on him once more. Those firebenders who could see the duel cheered on their champion, knowing if anyone could kill the avatar it would be him. Naruto caught the young man with a brutal uppercut. This rattled the avatar, sending him slamming into a large piece of rubble. Naruto strode towards him, his purpose evident as he raised the golden kanabo. However, he was stopped mid-swing as a heavy blast of water smashed into his body, sending his body careening away from the terrified avatar. One of the master waterbenders had arrived, and the man's Fu Manchu mustache waved in the wind lightly. Run, avatar, you must find another bending master. Quickly, the old master said as Naruto began to rise. Aang quickly began to run, whistling loudly. A loud bellow responded to the whistle as a massive white behemoth rose from behind the tower, a flying bison. Naruto took no notice of this, however, as his arm embedded itself firmly within the waterbender's chest. The man was barely able to speak as the hand was torn out, his body falling limply to one side. Naruto almost collapsed as the adrenaline slowly left him, the spirit's energy finally running dry as he made his way toward the palace. 3 days later, the Northern Water Tribe had fallen. Those who could run had run, fleeing in every direction. The fools had scattered like bee approaches, and now the commanders of the Fire Nation's invasion force stood at attention. Within the throne room, all except the monster himself. He sat by the throne lounging against the ice sculpture. Soon trumpets began to play loudly. Banners were raised by those soldiers. At the edges of the room, the need for pomp and ceremony was revealed, as the princess of the Fire Nation herself walked through the doors, clad in light yet strong armor. She strode over toward the throne, her bodyguards following behind. Azula took a seat, the throne slightly hissing as she did so. Naruto leaned back onto her legs, his head resting on her lower thigh as she played lightly with his hair. Her bright amber eyes locked with his own bright blue ones, practically speaking without actually saying a word. Then Azula spoke. Hello, Naru. I've missed you dearly. Her hand lightly stroked his face as she softly spoke those words. Azula sat tall on an ice throne, one leg crossed over the other, while her personal demon sat to her left, his back resting on her legs while she idly played with his hairs. In front of her stood 3 men, Admiral Zhou, Commander Veers, and her uncle Iroh. She was currently investigating the failure of all 3 men to capture the Avatar, albeit her uncle had done little wrong bar raise Zuko to be a softie. Speaking of Zuko, the boy had refused to come. Knowing that he would be there, he had clammed up and refused to leave his room. Azula didn't care much. Now, what I do want to know is why Zhou thought he was bold enough to order my agent around. Azula questioned, a single delicate eyebrow raised alongside. Zhou spluttered. The man looked like he'd been roughed up, having a barely concealed black eye and a bump from where an object had hit him. My lady? This fiend was meant to be the secondary to the invasion. He was meant to sit back until either the Avatar showed himself, or when the benders began to struggle. He strayed off as Azula raised one dainty palm. You lost. You misdirected the entire invasion, allowing the Avatar and the waterbenders to gain an advantage which then forced my precious agent to hold the line. She retorted, My lady, I disagree with my colleague. As you know, I fought alongside your agent, and he saved my life a multitude of times as well as those of my men. Commander Veers spoke up at that point, drawing the conversation to himself. Azula hummed, her bright cruel ember eyes moved across each of the men, while she still continued to play in Naruto's hair, citing deep rumbling groans of satisfaction. Guards, prepare the former Admiral Shao for execution, on the grounds of misconduct and general foolishness. Her voice was firm and strict. Around them Azula's personal unit stepped forward, preparing to take the disgraced admiral into custody. No! No matter what he has done, death is not the answer. Imprison him, yes, but do not kill him. Iroh finally spoke up. The man's loud proclamation drew the attention and ire of many. Naruto's own baleful blue eyes locked onto Iroh's own brown ones. The respect and love that once filled such a gaze were now replaced with sheer indifference and annoyance. Oh? My failure of an uncle is vouching for another failure, how quaint. First my older brother and now him. Azula, both you and I know that he doesn't deserve death. A demotion would be fine. He understands the gravity of the situation, however, death is never the answer. Iroh firmly stood his ground, knowing that even a slight break would falter his entire argument. Azula narrowed her eyes. The amber eyes reflected the flame which burned in her heart, these flames which now burned brightly at her uncle's perceived disrespect. Fine. He will not die, but he is stripped of his rank. He will be a lieutenant, and will return to officers' school, she responded with slight hints of agitation, masked by a veil of hilarity. Thank you, my niece. Azula waved off her uncle. Where is my timid big brother? Did he hear that my champion was here and scamper off somewhere to hide his failures? Iroh shook his head, knowing that at this point Azula was trying to get under his skin. However, the older man simply shook his head, knowing better than to rise to her bait. You should really respect your brother more, Azula. Not only is he still the crown prince, but he is family. Your first and only sibling. Azula scoffed. My brother is barely the crown prince. Father should come to his senses and just be done with him. After all Zuzu actually is a broken toy. Iroh shook his head, simply turning away from his niece and beginning to walk away. He stopped, however, turning back only once, yet his warm brown eyes did not meet Azula's sinister amber ones. They met the cold, uncaring eyes of his former foster son. Naruto, my son. Do not allow the opinions of others to influence you. I apologize for, however, I have wronged you, but I do love you. With that the older man left, leaving both teens to stew in their thoughts. Azula stood abruptly, causing Naruto to lean forward heavily. He looked at her in curiosity. Scouts have reported that they saw the Avatar heading toward the Earth Kingdom capital. However, to get there we must push through Jailing and a couple of other small towns. As she mentioned the Earth Kingdom, the entire palace began to shake, almost as if the wrath of Gaia had taken hold of the Northern Kingdom. The vibrations which shook the whole area originated from Naruto. His immense ability in earth-bending benign shone as he vibrated solid ice and water. Azula walked back toward him and lightly stroked his cheek, bringing his head down to hers. The rumbles slowly started to settle. Naruto's reckless hatred had always taken him when that particular place was mentioned, the sheer inundation of memories fueling his emotions. Calm yourself, boy. Do not allow your emotions to rule you. The torchbearer spoke softly, the voice of the spirit also helping to soothe the boy's annoyance. Summon a servant, and have my warships prepared. 6 hours later, Azula's fleet had left the Northern Water Kingdom in the late hours of the night. The large warships surrounded by smaller picket ships began to pick up speed. The firebenders on the ships burned away any icebergs as their engines continued to pump out pitch-black smoke. They cut across the narrow seas unmolested, the sheer power they carried with them ensuring any would-be pirates would be too scared to even think about trying to attack. This mattered little to either Azula or Naruto, both of whom spent a vast majority of the trip wrapped in each other's arms. This was particularly enjoyable for Azula, who was held within Naruto's larger grip. Yet this would not last. There was a heavy knock on the door to Azula's shared bedchambers. The said young woman slowly sat up, taking herself the warm grip of her favorite teddy bear. Cold rage settled on her face as she wrapped her lithe, shapely figure in a fine black silk robe. Opening the door, she was met with one of the royal bodyguards, the skull-masked man kneeling at the door, head down in respect. Yet this did nothing to cool Azula's annoyance. What is it? Her tone was fiery, yet at the same time as cold as ice. sweat formed on the man's face beneath his mask. Azula's rage was practically palpable. He stuttered somewhat. "Well, get out with it, you idiot, before you waste any more of my time." This seemed to spur him on. "I apologize, my lady, however, the port we were meant to dock at has been overrun by Earth Kingdom partisans. They will let us dock, but they're trying to get us to pay them." Having finally let out his message, the man seemed to deflate somewhat. Azula's eyes narrowed further. "And what has the commander decided?" "The commander wishes to pay them, simply to keep them out of our hair, seeing as they are not our direct enemies," he replied after a moment of pause. "This could be an opportunity. Tell the commander to deploy forces to recapture the port, kill any that resist, but focus on capturing them alive." She ordered the man. He continued to kneel even as she slammed the door in his face. He practically collapsed to both knees. Despite being much older than the girl, she still seemed to terrify him, especially when she was with that monster. The man slowly rose to his feet and began to slowly walk toward the bridge, thinking he should probably change his armor before he did so. At the port of Hashirama had been taken at least 3 days ago. Once a powerful Earth Kingdom trading port, the lagoon town/port city had been taken a couple of days beforehand. At least 400 rebels had taken seat within the city, murdering any guards who stood in their way and turning those who could be turned to their cause. The sheer fact that they had held the port for so long showed how defunct and useless the Earth Kingdom's armies were. But they weren't dealing with the Earth Kingdom. They were dealing with the Fire Nation now. They had all heard tales of the Fire Nation's brutality, of how powerful they were when they overran multiple large cities within the Earth Kingdom's borders. As such, they tried to negotiate, offering to not engage the Fire Nation and even work with them for a small sum of money. They should have known better, but they didn't realize that the Fire Nation did not negotiate with those below them. They only conquered and took those they wanted. As such, the rebels were in complete shock when 100 head-sized fireballs rained down on their forces. Those who were veterans were the first to react by raising large stone walls. The walls themselves were reinforced, however they still shook and buckled somewhat from the sheer force of the onslaught. There were some light injuries amongst them, however most were fine, simply shaken up for now. "It seems they didn't take the offer," one of the Earthbenders shouted to his friend, panic audible in his tone. "This doesn't make sense. The fireballs were too small and too spread out to do any major damage. That isn't in the Fire Nation's modus operandi to initiate an assault in such a way." Another veteran spoke up from behind a wall. It was true, they realized. The Fire Nation wouldn't have given them a chance to create a defense. However, they weren't given much time to contemplate what the Fire Nation's motives were, as within a couple of seconds the walls began to crumble. Simply of their own volition. This left shocked Earthbenders uncovered, and to their horror, Fire Bender units had already breached the first defenses, landing without any casualties. However, the usually highly aggressive and offensive Benders were not using their intense abilities and were instead using extensive martial arts to take down the rebels. They were effective, using their bending katas without their element. The heavy use of acrobatics along with the heavy blows and weaving retreats proved to be more effective than the slower yet stronger blows. The quick flurry of strikes combined with the sheer strength that many of the firebenders contained, whilst not on the level of the earthbenders themselves, was still considerable, and as such knocked many earthbenders flat. This led to mass surrenders from the rebel earthbender units, most of whom were conscripts who had been drafted by the rebel commander and didn't wish to fight for their cause or that of the Earth Kingdoms. Those who were actual fighters also surrendered, knowing they could not hold out by themselves. However, unsurprisingly, there were those who continued to try to fight, showing off the well-known stubbornness of the earthbender kind. However, they were far and few between, and these were quickly subdued and then beaten, putting them close to death but still not killing them. After the quick yet brutal battle, the rebels had been forced to kneel, lining the main street as the largest of the Fire Nation battleships pulled in next to the dock. The sailors on board lowered the massive boarding plank which slammed into the wooden dock. The first to march off was tall, well-built soldiers, 30 in number. Their armor was a dark blue accented with white flame-like marks around its edges. The bodysuit beneath was a black bodysuit which seemed to contrast nicely. The earthbenders could feel the sheer power that rolled off these men. The group halted at the end of the gangplank, splitting into two groups and standing on either side of the plank akin to a guard of honor. Next to come down the plank was the monster himself. Naruto wore a similar armor to those troops who had come before him, however with slight differences like the haori he wore and the kanabo which stayed strapped to his back. He slowly walked down, his eyes scanning across motley groups of earthbenders. He halted at the end of the plank, turning and facing back toward the ship, and they saw why. Azula herself made an appearance. The young woman wore armor that was practically the same as those that closely surrounded her, being blue and black, in high contrast to the usual Fire Nation armor. However, hers still had flecks of gold around the collars and cuffs. She slowly walked down the gangplank, uncaring and almost unbothered by the bodies which lay at their knees before her. She even grinned at them, sadistically taking pleasure from their current positions. She then surprisingly spoke. "You know who I am, and you probably know why we're here." She started. The dead silence was her only answer, but she seemed unbothered, pressing on. "We have two objectives. Destroy the brutal and tyrannical Earth Kingdom regime, who cruelly and unjustly terrorized these lands for a millennia. And the second, to hunt down and capture the Avatar." At that, murmurs and slow rumbles broke out amongst the imprisoned benders. The Avatar was alive? He had returned. Why hadn't he saved them? All these were comments Azula heard herself, and all of which she knew would push her plans into action. The Avatar has seen the terrible things which have occurred, and he did nothing. He saw how certain elements within my own nation brutalized cultures, yet he did nothing. That is why I wish for you to join us. The port city was quiet. Deathly so. The Earthbenders didn't know how to react, especially the veterans who had been drafted into fighting a brutal campaign against these same people. I offer you sanctuary. All I wish for in return is your complete subservience. The silence was still deafening. However, it was quickly broken. A young Earthbender, a man no older than 20 but a veteran nonetheless, stumbled towards her. The guards prepared to move in interception, however a singular glance from Naruto made them stand down. The boy fell to his knees before the duo. His head was practically grazing the ground. "I will serve. I devote myself to your cause, but please feed me and my family." Azula said nothing as Naruto stepped forward, raising one of his hands as he rigidly touched the older man's head. "Death before dishonor. Death before dishonor." Jailing, Southern Earth Kingdom, uncontested region. The town of Jailing is a rich, untouched town. Nestled between mountainous regions, the area was practically untouched by the surrounding death and war. This allowed those who lived there to grow fat and lazy. However, this only benefited the rich. Those who couldn't afford to live good lives were left to rot in the slums and alleys on the outskirts of the city. One family ruled Jailing, the Bifongs, an ancient family which claimed to come from the Avatar themselves. However, this was hardly believable to any that actually cared. The Bifongs were a small family. Their patriarch Liu Beifong was a co-founder of the illustrious Fire Earth Refinement Company. His wife Poppy Beifong was the political player within the family. It was due to her involvement that the Beifong family continued to rule Jailing. Then we come to the last of their little family, Toph Beifong, the 16-year-old heiress of the family. She was the sole child and inheritor of the Beifong fortune, and as such, she was raised to be poised and elegant. However, she was much the opposite. She was born blind. This, as a result, caused her parents to be overprotective, akin to smothering her. And she hated it. Toph tried her best to live as they wanted, but she could not. She loved her freedom, and she hated to be waited upon, and because of this, she was now confined to her room. Her earthbending teacher having informed her parents of her latest breakout attempt. "Toph, why do you keep doing this? Do you not understand that we are doing this for your own good? You are too important and too fragile to risk, my darling," Liu Beifong said to his daughter. He sat before her door. It being completely padlocked and chained, the man's daughter did not deem him worthy of a response. She hated the man. She hated the fact that to him she was weak and unable to protect herself. Toph wanted to prove them wrong so badly. And she would. She'd prove them all wrong. 4 days later. It had been almost a week since Toph had been confined to her room and the mansion. She, however, had heard much news from the maids and servants who entered. 2 pieces of news stood out the most to her. The first was the news of the princess of the Fire Nation burning her way through the Earth Kingdom and its paltry defenses. Although what did pique her interest was the rumor of the almost mythical Earthbender which seemed to accompany the princess. Toph really wanted to battle him and test her mettle against a veteran Earthbender. One that wasn't scared of hurting her, at least. Oh, if she knew how close he actually was. The second bit of news was that of the Avatar apparently being nearby. Now that did surprise and intrigue her. But she also cared little about an old man who couldn't do his job. So, it was a deep surprise when she sensed her door being unlocked and an individual with extremely light footsteps within the mansion. It was her father who unlocked the door, the older man coming to a stop within the doorframe. "Toph, my darling daughter. The Avatar has arrived and has deemed us worthy of a visit, allowing us to host him for breakfast. You have to be present, however, I don't want any of that escaping nonsense. Am I clear? You don't need to worry about me. Her answer was short and crisp. Two members of the Beifong household guard approached her and took up positions beside her, ensuring she couldn't escape even if she wanted to, at least as far as they knew. Well, let us go see the Avatar then. Aang somewhat recognized the young female that sat at the end of the table opposite to himself. After all, there was only one person at the earthbending tournament who could bend almost as well as any old master, even better in some cases. Aang had just about kept up with the earthbender known as the Blind Bandit. Speaking about the said fighter, this girl looked very similar to her. Blind? Check. Same height as him? Check. She couldn't be anyone else but the Blind Bandit. Her father wouldn't stop talking and he didn't want to be rude and interrupt. Sokka beside him happily gorged himself on the food that had been presented to him. Katara, while less enthusiastic, still also enjoyed the food. So young Avatar, what brings you to Jailing? Lao Beifong asked, his curiosity finally getting the better of him. I'm here to find an earthbending master. It's my next element on the list, and when that's done, I'll be able to stop the Fire Nation's advance and bring balance to the world, he replied, smiling brightly. Lao nodded and motioned to his left. We have quite a few earthbender masters here that you could choose from. In fact, Master Yu here is one of the best within Jailing. However, if you want anyone better, you'd have to go to the capital. He finished. Aang looked slightly confused. The girl had slightly sat up at the mention of an earthbending master, yet it was barely visible. No need, your daughter is an amazing earthbender. I'm pretty sure she could teach me everything I need to know. After all, she almost beat me in an earthbending. A sharp kick interrupted his explanation. Lao shook his head. You are mistaken, Avatar. Toph is blind and is still learning the basics. She could not effectively teach you anything. The man seemed to scoff. But Mr. Beifong, the badger moles that taught the first earthbenders were blind. Do not give me a lesson in history, Avatar. I do not care for it. My daughter will not teach you anything, and if you continue to insist, I will have you thrown from this household. At that, the man's bodyguards stepped forward. Mr. Beifong, please just listen. I'm pretty sure that your daughter was. Aang didn't even get to finish his sentence. Master Yao, Captain Toph, please escort the Avatar and his compatriots off the compound. It seems they've overstayed their welcome. It had seemed that Aang had pressed too far. Toph grinned to herself, her milky white eyes twinkly somewhat. Twinkle Toes almost gave her away, but it wouldn't be that easy. It had been several days since Azula had taken the port city. It had been a peaceful couple of days. Only the odd earthbender scouting party that had to be captured and silenced. Naruto had led the training of the new earthbender unit, pushing them past their limits. Both the older veterans and the younger lesser trained men had performed well. At the rate they were going, they would be better than their brethren within the earthbending army. Azula had watched with a dark grin spread across her face. First waterbenders, now earth. Soon enough her army would be one of the strongest within the area. She continued to watch on as they trained. Her personal regiment of earthbenders and waterbenders wore the blue and black that she wore, however in certain areas of their uniform golden circles represented their former allegiance. Azula stood from where she was seated, straightening out her uniform and stepping down from the shaded palanquin. She began to approach the still training benders. As she did so, she was followed closely by 2 firebender bodyguards. Naruto stood at the front of the group. The top half of his uniform and his haori were off to one side, allowing both his tattoos and his scars to be seen by all. Those he trained were dressed in a similar manner, sweat pouring off each and every person. Naruto noticed Azula approaching from the corner of his eye. Kneel to the Fire Princess. As he said this, he fell to a knee, the men and women behind him quickly following suit, not wishing to gain the ire of their commander. Naruto. Azula purred. What have you learned so far about the area we are in? She asked. The scouts have reported that there are little to no forces present in large numbers. The earthbenders are scattered across the area for at least a kilometer to the closest town, he reported. Azula raised a single dainty eyebrow. What is the town and its size? Jailing, a medium-sized mining town owned by the Beifongs, a noble family descended from powerful earthbenders. He paused for a moment. They may be sympathetic to our cause due to their dealings with the Fire Nation. Azula nodded. We will move out to Jailing within an hour. If we move quickly, we should be there by nightfall. She finished, moving back toward the palanquin. But she paused, sending a side-eye back to her love. Take the new task force and capture the city. Ensure that the Avatar cannot gain a bending master within the city. Azula then came close, lovingly stroking his chin and face. Stay safe. And do not fail me. She turned away, her speech complete, and her orders given. Naruto stood, turning on his heel as he did so. Prepare for deployment. 50 minutes later, 150 soldiers of the newly formed brigade moved quickly through a dense forest. Their blue and black uniforms were layered and covered with leaves and grass camouflaged against the trees. In front of them was their target, the city of Jailing. Guards controlled the gates, watching and inspecting those who entered the city. About 30 earthbenders were waiting around. None seemed to be too aware of their surroundings. 2 waterbenders approached their position, the men in front of them oblivious to their machinations. 4 icicles flashed from the brush line, piercing 4 individual earthbenders immediately. The rest sluggishly moved to protective positions, the gates beginning to shut. 14 earthbenders who hadn't moved quickly enough fell into a large sink trap, the earth closing up above them immediately afterwards. The remaining earthbenders went back to back, aiming to face the enemy. The panic that stretched across their face was clearly visible. The brush and forestry moved before them, revealing many shadows. Too many to be anything else but an ambush. The last of the shadows moved, revealing Naruto in all his strikingly dangerous glory. A dark Shinigami mask covered his face with black cloth lining the edges of the mask. Blood seemed to leak from the mouth's jagged teeth. He tilted his head slightly, staring deep into the eyes of the men who still lived. Yield or die. Around him more and more shadows began to appear, and camouflaged soldiers appeared next to him, all masked. However, unlike his own mask, theirs were all blank. The earthbenders surrendered, dropping to their knees and allowing themselves to be captured. Naruto looked at the gate, slight disgust marring his face. He drew his kanabo and swung. The solid gold and wrought metal club smashed through the stone gate, bringing down the small structure. He turned back toward his men and nodded. A thick mist began to roll into the city, flowing into the streets and heavily confusing the citizens who moved about their day. The skies began to quickly cloud over, drowning out the sun. With Toph, she could feel the moisture in the air. It was thick on her skin, almost unnatural. She could also feel the vibrations of the earth moving and even people being trapped beneath it. Then she felt him. How could she not? He was like a beacon of light within the dark. The guards around the mansion began to speak about a thick mist spilling into Jailing, blanking out everything around them. It was the start of summer. The cities had never seen such thick mist before, but she knew differently. She knew what was within that mist. Toph, head back to your room. This mist is too dangerous for you to be walking around in. Lao said to her. The Avatar had left some time ago. However, that didn't matter. The doors of the mansion were blown open. 2 guards sliding along the floor unconscious, their faces black and blue. Lao looked in surprise and concern. Toph, go quickly. Master, you take her and keep her safe. More guards piled into the room, aiming to keep the lord safe. You tried to push the princess along but found that she wouldn't budge. Her smaller and daintier frame belied her true strength. The master earthbender actually struggled to push the girl. Her bright pale eyes remained locked on the open door, waiting for whatever this feeling was to reveal itself. And it was as if the being could understand her call. Shadows began to make themselves more apparent. 2, 3, 4, 9. More and more shadows made themselves visible within the mist. However, only one actually called out to Toph's soul. Only one caught the pure intensity of her attention. The center shadow began to move forward, the mist peeling away from its form, revealing a heavily customized firebender uniform. However, what drew their attention was the haori draped over it, as well as the golden weapon it wielded, the corruptor. He who turns all to ash, he whispered, his grip on Toph falling lax as his eyes bulged. Naruto tilted his head slightly as he watched the group, his eyes focusing more on the female who stared back at him. Naruto chucked a scroll at the Beifong clan leader. The terrified man fumbled with the black and red scroll, just about managing to open it. He quickly read the scroll, his eyes flickering across the documents, which began to make him pale. The princess of the Fire Nation is coming here? He asked, his voice trembling. Naruto nodded, still saying nothing. He began to walk forward, totally ignoring the older man and his wife. You are an earthbender, no? Naruto said. His light blue eyes stared deeply into Toph's milky white ones. Her eyes displayed little emotion. Yet Naruto could see the passion and feel the sheer power that emanated from her. She is one of the blessed. The voice that sounded as if a mountain was falling within his head responded. What are you talking about? Lao straightened up, seeing that this monster was speaking to his precious and only daughter. Yes, she is. However, she is not a good one. Not only that, she is blind, so you would do well to leave her. His tirade was cut short by a large block of thick earth covering his mouth and lower neck. Naruto didn't even need to look at the man continuing to look at the earthbender before him. Lady Toph. It would be to your benefit if you followed me for a moment, Naruto said to the teen, who at the order hidden in a request nodded. After leading him through the house towards the back, he suddenly stopped, causing Toph herself to stop. I know what you are, and I know how you do it. He was interrupted when a massive sharpened pillar of earth erupted from the ground before him, aiming for the soft flesh of his throat. He simply sighed, breathing out a small stream of fire that melted the shard of earth. Toph jumped back, a grin stretched across her face. You're strong. I could feel you before you even entered the city. It's almost like I'm being drawn to you by something, she replied as she moved away from the duel bender. Naruto simply removed his mask, stashing it against his hip. He'd already told his subordinates not to interfere on the pain of death. I know who you are, blind bandit. You hold the very important position of being the only earthbender I respect. He started as he began walking towards the shorter woman. Earthen spikes appeared and disappeared with each step he took. Her connection to Mother Gaia is similar to yours, yet purer. That got a slight eyebrow quirk. So she's just like myself and Azula then? Yes. However, as your bending is purer than a normal bender due to being a dual bender, your connection to a single element is less pure than that of a blessed bender. Toph stomped on the ground, and at her action, a platform lifted from the ground, and two large boulders orbited the large platform. Come get me, if you think you're hard enough. Her taunting grin quickly drew one from Naruto. He removed his Haori, placing it to one side. He breathed in and exhaled a torrent of boiling flames. Toph could feel the heat even from her elevated position. The grin cut across her face. With a flick of her hand, the twin boulders streaked toward her target akin to meteors toward a planet. Naruto ignored these boulders, coating his hands in flames and diving straight through one and turning the other to dust. Using his momentum, he propelled himself upwards, landing upon Toph's platform. Rather than running like he believed she would, the girl stood her ground. She kneeled, avoiding the first swipe of Naruto's enflamed hands, her hands sweeping the ground and gathering clumps of dirt. She struck back with an uppercut, her arms encased in hardened earth. Naruto narrowly avoided the uppercut, her hand scraping his face lightly. He jumped back, aiming to gain some space between himself and his sparring partner. You're good. Really good. I'm impressed, Naruto said, nodding at the shorter woman. Thanks, hotcakes, you're not too bad yourself. That magma crap you do is pretty strong, she responded. Naruto shook off her nickname. Why do you stay here? You are strong enough to rule this place single-handedly, yet you stay? He asked, his voice lightly filled with curiosity. I could. But I'd be by myself. Plus we wouldn't be having such a fun fight now, would we? She responded. Naruto nodded, understanding her well-placed point. Join us. Azula is planning things. She's preparing for a fight. One that will shake this world and the next completely. I could join you, but the Avatar is looking for a master earthbender, so why shouldn't I just join him? So, you would rather travel with some pretentious monk who ran away when he was needed the most? That coward left people like us to rot and die. Or in your case, to be pampered to death. He had to avoid a large rock at those words. Toph seemed to consider his words, for he was speaking some truths. Aang had been depended upon and worshipped even though he'd given up on the world. This needed to be changed. Don't you hate earthbenders though? So why have you not killed me yet? She asked, a singular well-cut eyebrow raised in apprehension. Naruto nodded and sighed. I'm not going to bore you with some long-ass drawn-out story. Earthbenders murdered my family and tortured me. They did that all because they found out I was a descendant of firebenders. And not only that, but because they thought I was the effigy of some evil avatar. He said casually. Toph could see the somewhat pain that swept across his face but chose not to comment. So what now? She asked him. Naruto simply grinned. Well, I have to ask you some things first. Line break. Aang, Katara, and Sokka hadn't been prepared for this. They'd been walking the streets when the mist rolled in. Katara and Aang could feel that the mist was different. Aang had been assaulted by visions and screams from what he assumed to be the former Avatar's spirits. The only spirits which hadn't reacted poorly to the vast mist were the ones who originated from the Fire Nation. We have to leave, Sokka said, his voice cracking somewhat. This mist isn't natural. We have to go back, Aang said to his compatriots, both of which wanted to argue with his sudden demand. Aang, we have to leave. If we go back to the palace, any number of things could happen. We don't even know what's causing this mist. Sokka argued back. If you want to go back and try to convince her to come with us, then be my guest. We're going back to Appa. He finished. Fine, you guys head back and get Appa ready too. Aang was cut off by a loud clanking sound, the sound of metal hitting the earth. That combined with the screams of citizens further within the mist confirmed the thought they all had. Jailing was under attack. But by who? Who could manipulate the mist to such an extent? The only waterbenders who could have done such a thing had been massacred at the Northern Water Tribe. Sokka's eyes widened fearfully at the implications of his thought. Aang, blow away the mist. Now, Aang looked confused but obliged nonetheless. He quickly swung his bow staff, generating a large gust of wind, which picked up and carried the mist away. This did two things. It revealed the eerie, almost empty street. Almost empty. A man and a woman stood at the end of the street. Both wore dark uniforms, their faces covered by bone-white masks. They stared down the Avatar's entourage. Guys. They don't look very friendly. Sokka was the one to break the tense silence. Aang stared at the twins stared at Aang. The man was the first to move. He took to the sky, jumping high in a single bound. With a flick of his hand, a jet of icy water was flung at almost imperceptible speeds toward Katara. Aang was the first to react, redirecting the water spear with a blast of wind. The woman took that moment to jump into action, stomping on the ground. An entire row of stone spines cut through the earth towards the gang. Aang slammed his staff into the ground again, lifting a barrier of dust to shield his friends. The twins stared into the dust cloud, waiting to see if their attacks had hit. However, when the dust cleared, they were nowhere to be seen. The twins looked at each other and nodded, spinning around and rushing back the way they had come, apparently not noticing the gang hidden on the rooftop. The trio felt fear. Those couldn't have been Fire Nation. They have similar uniforms, but no earth or water bender would betray their people to fight for those fire bastards. Sokka spat, still shaken up at the ambush that could have gone so wrong. I agree. But something bigger is going on. You and Katara get Appa. I'll look for Toph and try to get her to come with us to Ba Sing, as Aang said, his big eyes locking with his compatriot's own. Aang, it's too dangerous. We have no idea what's going on here, and you want to go get someone who obviously doesn't want to come by yourself? Katara tried to reason with the Avatar, trying to get him to understand the dangers of such a plan. It was her brother who broke the stalemate. Sokka turned to his sister. I'll go with Aang and watch his back. You get Appa ready to move when Aang blows the whistle. Katara still seemed uneasy at the idea but reluctantly agreed, watching as her brother and Aang slipped back into the alleyway. She let out a small prayer to the spirits for their protection. They'd need it. Aang and Sokka had been walking for almost 20 minutes, and they were still no closer to finding out who the masked individuals were. At nearly every important intersection or building that the duo passed, there were at least 3 standing there, sometimes more. But the duo always tried to sneak past without bringing attention to themselves. If these ones were anything like the others, the fight would be intense. So they avoided them when they could. They'd finally approached a large manor where they'd had the meal with the Beifeng family. There were a handful of critical changes that had been made which drew their attention right away. 1. The mansion and its outer walls had been somewhat fortified. The walls cleared and makeshift earth walls were set up. The second change was the large flags which hung from its upper windows. Flags bearing a blue flame embroidered in gold. Aang's staff fell from his hands as he fell to his knees, Sokka looking down at him in slight worry. The Fire Nation, they followed us here. We led them straight to these people. Aang sounded tired, his voice was quiet and sad. Aang, we have a bigger problem, Sokka said quietly, pointing toward the white-masked individuals who stood around the mansion, not to mention the normal uniformed Fire Nation soldiers who stood outside the compound. I think the Fire Nation are brainwashing benders to fight for them, otherwise why would an earthbender and a waterbender fight for this filth? Sokka spat, his hatred and disgust shining through for a moment. I think Toph is inside. We need to rescue her and get her out before they can get to her, Aang said finally, his mind made up. Then we see if we can stop this madness. He was about to leap from his perch, but Sokka grabbed him, stopping his movement before it even began. Aang spun around, annoyed at the sudden grab. What, Sokka? If you're not up for it, you can wait here till we signal Katara. However, that wasn't the problem. Sokka was as pale as death, as if the man had seen a spirit. He simply pointed. Aang spun around, and from their perch, upon a rooftop, he saw what had made Sokka so pale. Azula. Perched neatly upon a massive armored vehicle, and wherever Azula was, that beast of the end times was sure to follow. Aang shook off the cold feeling that had settled upon his shoulders. Turning to Sokka, he shook the boy out of his stupor. We need a plan and a diversion. With the Fire Nation. Naruto stood at the entrance of the former Beifeng mansion. His Haori and Kanabo had been placed back onto his form. Around him, his soldiers stood as an honor guards awaiting the arrival of his princess. He had locked Toph away in one of the larger rooms within the mansion. The girl had come along freely and did tend to stick close by to him since he'd taken over the city. She didn't even bat an eyelid at her parents being locked away in the dungeons below the city. Although she had told him about something being down there, something large and alive. He'd investigate later. Naruto snapped out of his thoughts as Azula's transport pulled into the compound. The tank was one of the newer models, much larger than the rest of the convo. Azula sat on its turret, and a familiar figure sat next to her. The long ponytail and bright baggy clothing did nothing to hide her cheerful smile. "Tai Li, hey Naruto," she shouted as she leapt from the tank into a cartwheel, rolling to a stop in front of her friend. "Hello, Tai Li?" Naruto's mask muffled his voice. His red eyes tracked Tai Li but quickly moved back to Azula once he saw her leap from the tank, landing as gracefully as ever. Behind her, hundreds of men dismounted from other vehicles or beasts of war. "Lady Azula, Jailing is yours." Azula smiled as Tai Li continued to practically vibrate with contained energy. "Good job, that mask does suit you, I must say, although it's a shame it covers your handsome face. Now show me our new base of operations." She purred as she walked toward the large double doors. On either side of the doors stood members of Naruto's experimental unit, 2 earthbenders in fact. Now that combat had been completed, they wore armbands that denoted their benign specialties, green or blue denoting earthbender or waterbender respectively. Both soldiers opened the double doors, allowing their commanders to enter the mansion, which within had been completely changed from what it had been under the Beifeng family. The flying boar which had been hung over the entrance was removed, being replaced with a blue flame symbol. Things that would usually make a house comfortable and any personal and familial possessions had been removed and burned. The walls had been left bare and many rooms had been turned into barracks or prison cells. All in all, it was as if the Beifeng family had never existed. Lao, who at one point had been a secret Fire Nation supporter, hadn't been too happy at the takeover of his family estate. However, with the presence of the corruptor, he didn't dare speak out, benign, confined to his room. "What of our guests?" Azula asked, looking up the grand staircase. Naruto removed his mask as Tai Li sat on his shoulders, having climbed up there after they entered the building. "Well, they didn't take to the conditioning well, but I believe with some time we should have them on the side. If not, we'll just keep them contained." Naruto didn't get to finish his sentence, as a burst of wind slammed open the double doors at the front of the mansion. The 2 guards who'd been there before had been flung into the mansion, sliding across the floor and being deposited by the small group's feet. Tai Li flipped from Naruto's shoulders as he prepared to fight the Avatar. "It seems the little coward is here, still trying to rescue those you ran from all those years ago?" Azula taunted, her amber eyes glaring devilishly. 36,789. Naruto simply stated. Azula's grin grew wider. "What's that supposed to be?" Aang asked, genuinely confused, but continued to hold his guard as Naruto's men surrounded him. 36,789. "Human life is so fragile, so easy to snuff out," he sneered. Aang's eyes widened in horror. He couldn't believe it. "You didn't, there's no way you could have." Naruto grinned as he removed his Haori, a wide-fanged grin akin to that of a smiling demon. 36,789 lives, all gone. "They're all on your head. You could have stopped us, could have killed me, but you didn't, and now those men, women, and children are feeding Mother Gaia." Naruto caught the heavy end of the bow staff, impressed at the speed that the Avatar had moved to bring it down on his head so effectively. "If I were anyone else, that would have caught me." He let go of the staff as Aang launched himself into the air, jumping away from the menace. Aang leaned back, swinging his staff with as much power as he could gather, sending an enormous hammer of air towards his target. However, Naruto did little in terms of movement, stomping the ground and raising a large pillar of earth, large enough for him, Azula, and Tai Li to take cover. Some of his men weren't so lucky and were sent flying through the house and into the large backyard, hitting the ground hard and rolling away. Azula leaned around the pillar, firing off a blast of her infamous azure flames. Aang dropped, falling below the small spurt of flames. Naruto dropped the barrier and dashed toward the Avatar, a single fist raised and coated in dense rock. Aang weaved around the first right cross and deflected the follow-up. However, the shoulder check and subsequent over-shoulder throw caught him off guard, sending him soaring toward the backyard. He landed as lightly as possible, using the air to cover his body as he struck the ground. He had little time to recover, however. Azula ran forward, jumping and propelling herself upwards off of Naruto's broad shoulder, launching a trio of fireballs toward the still-dazed Avatar, who rolled out of the way of the vicious attack and to his feet. Naruto went to rush him again but was stopped by the combined forces of a stone encasement and a boomerang, the latter of which clattered harmlessly against his vambrace. Naruto turned to the newcomers, one of which he knew all too well and the other he'd only seen in a passing glance: Toph and Sokka. Toph wore a different outfit from when Naruto had first fought her. Now she wore a beige and green outfit, with a light white haori over the top of it. However, it did do well to show off her lithe yet amazing figure. The Earthbender and the Tramp. Naruto kicked out of the earthen boot and turned to the newcomers. So it appears you've made your choice then? That's unfortunate. I had high hopes for you, unlike the rest of your disgusting people. Naruto sneered, his anger somewhat surprisingly hidden. Toph grunted, her milky eyes betraying nothing. You come here, destroy my home, imprison my parents and think I would ever think about joining you and your merry band of whores. You'd be insane. She finished her torrent of words by jumping and slamming her fist into the ground, sending a wave of earth toward the firebenders. Naruto leapt over it, drawing his kanabo as Sokka rushed him, dual-wielding a club and a cutlass. The younger teen swung both wildly, trying his best to even land a blow on the more experienced fighter. Naruto weaved in and out of his attacks, placing his weapon back in its holster. He drove a punch upward into Sokka's ribcage, winding him. Then he kicked out, sending the boy flying back out of the house and where the Avatar had been busy fending off the flurry of blows from Azula. Toph and Naruto clashed, slamming their fists together as the two benders worked to try to drive the other one off. Toph would strike with slow yet heavy blows whilst Naruto struck back, his blows equally as heavy yet also having a heated effect to them. They continued to trade blows, Toph engulfing her hands within a thick layer of rock and Naruto a thick flowing layer of flames. Each punch was caught, and each kick was deflected. The two seemed to be like yin and yang, never being able to overpower the other. Finally, it was Toph who seemed to win out, slamming her hands against his chest and encasing it in an earthen vest. Sorry hotcakes, you're just too insane for me. Toph turned and began to run outside. Aang was still engaged in his fight and Sokka had just started rising from the hit he'd taken. Azula leapt into the air again, prepared to bring down an arc of flame upon the Avatar's head. However, she was blown back by a sudden gust of wind, hitting the ground and rolling into a quick fighting position. However, she quickly dropped it, knowing it was pointless, for above them hovering was the Avatar's furry pet. Aang had already boarded the massive beast, with Toph and Sokka quickly clambering aboard afterwards. Katara quickly whipped the reins, getting Appa to rise up quickly. Everything had gone to plan. That was until there was a loud scream of pain. Katara turned to look to see what had been struck, only for her heart to break. Her brother had been struck. He was writhing in pain, and boils and flash burns racked the left side of his torso. She quickly dropped the reins and rushed over, drawing the water from her cantina and covering his burns as Aang took the reins. We need to get to Ba Sing Se. Sokka was writhing in pain. The boy hadn't stopped wriggling and crying. The burns on his side almost had a mind of their own, pulsing and convulsing. Aang could still feel the sheer heat that the wounds emanated even as she tried to cool them off with her bending. The four hadn't spoken since Sokka had been hit. They'd been riding for hours without sleep, passing over mountains and valleys. After a couple more moments of flying, Appa started to descend. Aang was startled into action when Appa hit a tree, the branches almost knocking Aang from his seat. The young airbender fought to land Appa safely on the ground, the exhausted bison uprooting numerous trees before finally settling just before a boulder that practically dwarfed Appa. The sudden jolt hadn't helped Sokka's condition, the young man screaming as his damaged arms struck the edge of the saddle. Tears welled in Katara's tired eyes as she saw the slowly worsening condition of her brother. Aang spun around, hearing the cries of Sokka. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't realize Appa was so tired and Sokka wasn't doing too well. We're going to have to rest here for a little while. After that crash landing, Appa is in no state to fly. Aang said apologetically. Deep bags were seen below his eyes. All of them were in a sorry state. Toph created a small land bridge to Appa, allowing them to remove their wounded. However, that was all she did. Rather than helping move any of the other equipment, or tending to Sokka, Toph built a makeshift tent and slammed the door, gaining the attention of a tired Katara and Aang. What is she doing? Doesn't she realize that we're going to need help taking the stuff off of Appa? Katara started. However, she realized she was talking to herself when the subtle glow of Aang's tattoos caught her attention. Within Aang's mind, Aang was at a loss. He didn't want to kill, he didn't want to remove a life no matter how rotten from this mortal coil. He needed to help Sokka too. He needed to speak with his past lives. Avatar Kyoshi. I need your wisdom. Aang waited for a moment. A light blue glow emanated from the space before him as the tall and imposing Avatar appeared. Avatar Kyoshi. I face an enemy who is almost beyond anything I've seen before. He wields 2 elements and is as ruthless as Ozai himself. What should I do? Kyoshi paused for a moment, looking down at her spiritual descendant, Avatar Aang. This foe you speak of is an ancient one. The boy, who this evil inhabits, is unfortunately only so corrupted due to my inaction. However, to purge this world of that evil you must kill the boy. It is the only way. She turned to wisps as she finished. Aang looked up in shock. This couldn't be the only way, there had to be another way of doing this. Avatar Yangchen. I need your wisdom. With another soft blue glow, Avatar Yangchen appeared before him. The evil that your enemy contains is not a new one. One of our predecessors fought him. Avatar Gun. Do not in any circumstances summon that man. He was fundamentally changed by his duel with that monster. It scarred him horribly both physically and spiritually. Yangchen paused for a moment. The silence was almost deafening. Aang spoke before his fellow airbender could. You were the best healer amongst the avatars. Please help me help my friend. He was hit by the fire from that being we spoke of. Yangchen seemed to mull this over. Very well, but afterwards I have a task for you, Omashu. A massive flurry of flaming boulders soared through the air, akin to comets lighting up the sky. These comets slammed against the large fortress city of Omashu. The massive island-like fortress city sat immobile within a canyon. However, the usually peaceful city was currently under siege. Firebenders rushed towards the land bridge that connected the ancient city with the outside world. The earthbenders within the city launched massive boulders from their emplacements, crushing numerous soldiers in their landing. Those who could not bend launched arrows and readied trebuchets. The earthbenders were confident. The siege had been going on for a couple of days at most, and the Fire Nation had yet to breach their walls. This was the Fire Nation's third assault for the day, and it had already begun faltering. The men wanted to avoid advancing on the earthen bridge in case the defenders collapsed it. The wavering continued. Their officers were unsure of what to do, knowing full well that even a slight change could cause an immense rout. Well, that was until reinforcements arrived. Black and blue banners fluttered in the breeze. The sounds of marching soldiers and rolling tanks drew the attention of the beleaguered Fire Nation soldiers. They watched in awe as well-armored soldiers marched past them, stopping at the land bridge. They parted as Naruto rode through their lines, his large Komodo rhino pulling at its reins, wishing to be unleashed. He stopped just before it could cross the bridge. Tugging the reins, the massive beast turned and Naruto faced the armies, men of the Fire Nation. Omashu stands in our way of a peaceful world. A world ruled by the strongest nation. He roared, and flames spewed from his mouth as he spoke. His Komodo rhino reared, raising him even higher. This rallied many of the soldiers. They looked upon this monster in awe, and his sheer presence seemed to bolster the line anywhere he went. He turned towards the city and pointed. Boulders of fire and ash soared through the sky. Some of the Earth Kingdom soldiers took cover whilst others prepared to launch their own counters, and a number of the artillery strikes were stopped this way. Earthbenders launching smaller pieces of boulders through them to disrupt the hits. Naruto cared very little for this. With a single hand gesture, the assault restarted, this time with the demon at the head of it. He launched himself across the earthen bridge. The Komodo rhino he rode was fearless as the earthbenders began to destroy the bridge. Naruto gave another sharp signal. The traitor earthbenders began to steady the bridge, wrenching control from the earthbenders loyal to Omashu. When the defenders found that they could not crumble the bridge, they began to launch massive boulders at the soldiers that were currently charging towards them. Naruto covered the soldiers under his command, smashing apart any boulders that got too close. Not to mention the shifting walls of earth which stopped more conventional attacks. He leapt from his Komodo rhino, landing on the courtyard before the massive gates of Omashu. Placing his hands against the gate, he began to concentrate. Naruto could feel every grain of earth within the gates. He could feel how his chi and will penetrated the thick blocks of earth, overriding and overpowering those of the gate guards. His chi was almost corrosive in the way it burned through the material. After he was sure that the material was fully under his control, he began to heave. Naruto's muscles bulged as he pulled against the massive gates. The soldiers behind him watched in quiet awe as the younger man slowly tore open the gates. They could see his struggle as the earthbenders within tried their damnedest to keep it closed. The earthbenders within the Azula company began to raise steps on the giant walls, their aim, to allow their troops to flood over the walls whilst their commander finished off the gate. Naruto gave one last heave, wrenching the large slab of rock from its position. His muscles screamed at him as he walked forwards a couple of feet. Fire Nation soldiers poured in from behind. Naruto dropped the massive gate, his eyes panning upwards. Omashu was massive. His forces had only breached the lowest levels and now they had to fight through the urban sprawl. The three smaller mountains would prove to be dangerous too. The earthbenders were forced into a full retreat. The Fire Nation tanks and overwhelming attacks were simply too much for the first stage of defenses. However, the quick advance did not to last. Soon the Fire Nation began to be bogged down. The earthbender forces had arrayed numerous defenses within the city. Earthen pits swallowed entire battalions whilst rock slides crushed tanks and forced the Fire Nation soldiers to take specific marked routes up towards the palace. Naruto and the Azul battalion were the tip of the spear. He led his forces through the defenses using his fantastical abilities. His flames washed through the defenses, turning any earthbender who lingered to ash. The only ones who managed to halt his advance were the elites of the Omashu royal court. Those men practically threw themselves at Naruto and the Fire Nation soldiers. Every now and then they'd burst from the ground or the walls with their gold and green armor protecting them from any stray blasts. Then they'd assault the Fire Nation forces, trying to drag down as many soldiers as possible. Sometimes they'd get 2 or 3 before being eviscerated. The Azul battalion soldiers ensured that the earthbenders could never get more than a handful of kills. Naruto had already destroyed 3 of the bastards before they could even assault the Fire Nation's pincer advance. Naruto heard a loud crack come from the sky. Looking up, he recognized the black flare. One of the pincers had become bogged down, most likely due to a high-priority enemy fighting in that section. Naruto started to move towards the buildings on the far side of the road. His aim was to level them so a section of his pincer could envelop the enemy. He didn't get 2 steps in before a shard of crystal jabbed up towards him. It had almost taken his foot. That was close. He looked down the length of the street. A tired-looking old man sat in a wheelchair. He was hunched over and had a long green robe which covered his body. He seemed to be laughing and snorting to himself. The blue armored soldiers moved to remove the man, but Naruto held his hand up, stopping their movement. "He's just an old man. Leave him. Help me move this crystal." The Fire Nation soldiers complied with his orders. One of the normal soldiers touched the crystal, aiming to try to smash through it. He died before he even realized what had happened. It had taken almost half a second, but the crystal had entirely covered him, practically engulfing him as if he were alive. The second man scrambled away, fear evident. Naruto didn't flinch. He slowly craned his head around his eyes, looking towards the old man whose right arm was now outstretched. The man was grinning, but it seemed to be a sad grin. "Leave. Omashu doesn't need any more bloodshed." His voice was croak. There was a slight bit of madness to it. No, Naruto dived into a roll, his heels sparking into a roaring flame which spiraled towards the still-sitting man. The pressurized flame curled out into a long tail. The blast of flame was dispersed by a massive rock wall. The man had stood by this point, and now Naruto could recognize him. The Mad King Bumi. One of the best earthbenders currently alive. This would truly be a fight of insane proportions. Bumi stripped off the long robe, revealing his muscled and scarred body. Naruto took a moment of pause to respect the man. He had, unlike Iroh, kept in shape for all these years, even though Iroh was not one to be trifled with either. Bumi took a running start, running a small distance before leaping into the air. He came crashing down a short distance later, and the earth bent like water, rising up in a massive tsunami of brick and dirt which roared toward the Fire Nation forces. Naruto responded in kind, drawing back and launching a condensed blade of heat at the attack. It split the wave, killing the momentum of both attacks. Naruto breathed in deeply, his chest expanding till he looked akin to that of a rooster. Then he breathed out. Like the dragons of old, a belch of flame spewed from his mouth, engulfing the entire street in deep crimson haze. As the flames sputtered out, Naruto noticed a small hole in the ground. His eyes widened a slight bit. The ground shook and crystals sprang all around Naruto's feet, trying to entrap him. In response, he began to heat the ground, cracking it and turning it to magma. Bumi leapt from underground a couple of meters from Naruto's position. In response, and to Bumi's surprise, he launched a wave of magma at the king of Omashu. Despite being caught off guard, he opened a chasm in front of him, forcing the lava to fall in and disperse. Naruto was already upon him, hands blazing. Bumi weaved around the punches. Coating his hands in earth, he blocked a punch, responding with a back fist which Naruto ducked under with an uppercut as his answer. This caught Bumi off the edge of his chin and sent him reeling. Grabbing his arm, Naruto dragged him in for an elbow that did not connect. Bumi slipped under the strike and hit Naruto with an enhanced uppercut, crushing ribs 10-6. What could have damaged you so much, child? You are a son of Terra and the Earth Mother loves you dearly, yet you are filled with nothing but searing hatred. Bumi was honest. His tone showed as much. Your people almost killed me. Your people turned me into the monster I am. Imagine having to feed off the flesh of your own parents to survive. Naruto spat back. He didn't need nor want pity from the elderly king. He simply wanted the man's head. Bumi shuddered as the boy's words bounced around his head. No man could remain sane. Bumi couldn't kill him, not as he was. There was too much to this boy to decapitate him now. Naruto wheeled back, his breathing labored. That last body hit had done some damage. He felt a surge of flame and a presence entered his mind. Be careful, child. This place limits our abilities. That man is not normal in the slightest. He can and will kill you. The sane voice from Jailing spoke. Naruto took note of it as the torchbearer hummed in agreement. Naruto spat out a couple globs of blood. His annoyance was high. Bumi wasn't untouched, however. The older man had sickly burns which trailed down his neck. He moved slightly slower, but it wasn't enough to put him down. Naruto launched forwards. 2 large jets of flames sprang from his feet as he skated across the earth towards the king of Omashu. In response, Bumi lifted a small house from its foundations, launching it at the blonde. Naruto's eyes widened a fraction as the house soared towards him, but he didn't stop. Placing both hands together, he pointed at the house. A thin stream of pressurized flames flowed forwards, cutting straight through the house and forcing Bumi to leap to his left. Naruto followed it up with a wide wave of magma, however, to Bumi's credit, he was prepared. The older man created a wide platform of crystal. This managed to hold the searing magma at bay. A long stream of fire rushed out and wrapped around Bumi's arm, causing him to let out a guttural cry of pain. Naruto pulled himself towards the apparently stricken king. A blade of flames issued from his clenched fist. He swung upwards as he closed in, the blade aiming to decapitate the king in one fell swoop. The soldiers behind watched in horror. Naruto lay slumped over Bumi's shoulder, a blade of crystal almost splitting him directly in half. The king of Omashu dropped his half-dead body. Take him. The crystal will keep him alive for as long as possible. Someone so young should not harbor such hatred. His voice was croaky and weak. He leapt away, but that did not remove the immediate danger. Earth Kingdom soldiers were beelining for their position. Roughly 100, led by a handful of royal guards, were charging towards them. The members of the Fire Nation pincer moved, scrambled around. 2 soldiers rushed over to where Naruto lay, his shallow breathing the only indication that the young man was still alive. They hefted him up, an arm around each of them, and moved him towards the tank. The Earthbenders were closing fast. They didn't have the numbers to force off a counterattack, especially after the brutal duel that had occurred. A large wave of water washed towards the oncoming Earthbenders, forcing them to take cover. Looking back, the now commander of the pincer recognized the Azul battalion. Full retreat. The Azul battalion will hold them off till we can get out, he called from his tank. 4 hours later, Azula stormed into the makeshift hospital. Her amber eyes were blazing with anger and worry. Behind her, Tai Li and Mai followed suit. With them came numerous officers from the Azul battalion. Each one was just as worried for their commander as the princess herself. They went deep into the hospital. It had formerly been bunking for factory workers, but they had long been evicted from the building. They could still see some of the personal objects from the said workers. Azula logged an order in her mind. She would have those personal effects burned as soon as possible. They moved into the basement, taking a flight of stairs down to his room. He had been given one of the largest rooms in the hospital. The floor was usually reserved for generals and members of the royal family, but they had made an exception. 2 ranking members of her battalion stood at the door. Both had taken combat positions at first, but soon snapped into a swift salute upon seeing the composition of the group before them. Azula ignored the salute and pushed the door open. Her eyes widened slightly. Naruto lay in the bed at the end of the room. It was a large double bed and seemed comfortable enough. He was sitting up and awake, fiddling with a small green crystal. Bandages wrapped his entire upper body and he was pale, paler than usual. His eyes were contemplative, almost as if he were thinking over some great mystery. When the door opened, his eyes snapped over to see who had entered his space. They softened slightly as he recognized who it was. Azula stormed up to his bed. "You absolute fool! How dare you almost die to that old goat!" Her anger was almost hollow. It was more the fear that hurt Naruto. "I'm sorry, it won't happen ever again." As he spoke, she grabbed him into a hug, her arms wrapping tight around him. Naruto in turn tightened his grip. Ty Lee jumped to join the hug. The gymnast was swept into it, much to Azula's chagrin. Mai and the rest of the officers watched in amusement. Finally, Naruto released the two women, allowing Ty Lee to stand and fix her clothes. Azula, however, remained on the bed, moving into a position which suited them both comfortably. Naruto turned to the officers who all knelt before his bed. "My men, how much of Omashu do we still maintain?" One of them, a major, spoke up. "We hold 2 out of the 4 spires, sir. The Earth Kingdom maintains a defensive position around the upper rings. They're using the sleds and the transportation system to reinforce any breakthroughs we make. Our Earthbenders are trying their best, but there aren't enough of them to make a difference." Both Naruto and Azula nodded, the woman playing with his hair lightly. "Maintain the lines as they are. We'll hold for the next couple of days. Tell any Earthbenders who are still capable to form defenses alongside the tanks." 2 of the officers stood and moved to carry out his orders. The others were about to leave as well, but Naruto stopped them with a hand. "I'm going to be gone for a couple days. Do not start the assault until I return. Ensure the men are prepared. Remember, weakness is a choice." His voice brokered no argument, and the men left to fulfill their orders in their entirety. Naruto turned to Azula. Her amber eyes peered into his, revealing every single secret he once contained. "I must get stronger. If Bumi wasn't a crazy fool, I would have been killed. I can't die while you all still need me." Azula kissed him lightly, shutting him up. Ty Lee pouted in what seemed like mock jealousy. After a couple of seconds, they stopped, coming back up for air. "Azula, it's not fair you get the hunk all to yourself." Azula ignored Ty Lee's tirade. "As long as you come back to me. That duel with King Bumi was closer than you think. The old goat is strong, but he lacks endurance." Azula had a critical eye for these things. It was almost as if she'd been watching the duel from the start. Naruto nodded. His mind raced with the thoughts of what would come next. "I won't be able to out-earthbend him. But he can outfight me." Azula nodded in agreement as she pecked him on the lips again. Naruto twitched slightly as he shifted in his bandages. Then Naruto slowly stood out of the bed, placing his robe over his bandages. Azula, however, was not completely finished. She slid off his bed and moved to stand in front of him. Her amber eyes narrowed slightly as she gripped Naruto's chin. Her lips pursed. "Get stronger and defeat King Bumi, and you may get a reward. Do not fail me, though. I love you too much for anything drastic to happen. Not to mention that the Avatar may be coming here soon." Naruto's eyes widened. "Do not fret. I will return in time for the next assault." Naruto finished, ensuring that Azula would not kill everyone in her annoyance. Naruto turned slightly as he felt someone tightly hug his side. Looking down, he saw the long braid of Ty Lee. Unlike her 2 best friends, Ty Lee showed her emotions freely. Naruto enjoyed it quite a bit. "Don't worry, Ty Lee. I'll be back soon enough." He patted her on her head lightly. These 3 would ensure he returned stronger than ever. Naruto turned to Mai. She stared at him with blank eyes. "Don't die." She was as to the point as ever. Naruto nodded his thanks and took up his kanabo. "Till I return." Naruto left the room, the faint smell of antiseptic following him. Azula huffed in annoyance as Mai turned towards her. "Are you still going to follow through with your plan?" "Yes. Without Naruto, things would have turned out for the worst. The Earthbenders will pay dearly for trying to take him from me." A blue flame sparked from Azula's delicately manicured hands. Ty Lee readily agreed. All 3 left the now empty room, knowing that no matter what happened, Omashu would fall to their hand. With Aang watched as Katara checked over her brother again. He had given himself over to Avatar Yangchen, and she had tried her best, but there were some things even the Avatar couldn't do. The burns Sokka had received were permanent. They were practically 4th-degree burns that had kept smoldering even after a couple of days and even after having water poured upon them. Yangchen had taken hours to even partially heal the wounds, and Sokka's whimpering hadn't made it any easier. and while it had some effect on Toph, couldn't tell how much damage it had truly done. Katara, he began softly, gaining the tired Water Tribe girl's attention. She hadn't stopped attending to her brother, and even now she fed him a simple soup. She looked over at Aang, her tired and tear-stricken face pained his heart. We need to leave for Omashu soon. Avatar Yongchen's help wasn't purely out of the kindness of her heart. She saw a vision of the king of Omashu dying and Omashu itself being engulfed in a tide of lava and blue fire. I can't let that happen. His eyes flickered down when he saw the innate rage that pulsed through her eyes at the mention of lava. No. There was a pregnant silence. Sokka was almost killed once already trying to fight that monster. I have no desire to see what happens should we fight him, and those crazy witches. Aang understood where she was coming from, but he needed them on side. Even Toph had lowered one of the walls which separated her from the outside world. I can't do this without any of you. Who knows, we might be able to find some more help for Sokka there. I know someone who lives in the city. He shouldn't be too old, hopefully. Katara looked at him. As long as we can save Sokka, it's not going to be easy. If what you say is true and those monsters are going to be there, we may as well prepare for the fight of our lives. It was the first thing she'd said all evening. Aang looked over at the blind girl. Yeah, if we head over from the eastern side, we can try to aim for the main plateau in front of the palace. Then we can try to convince the king to prepare for the siege. This was the most serious they'd seen Aang. Katara and Toph agreed. Katara went back to feeding her brother, her sniffles framing the night. Whilst Toph once again sealed herself within the tent, Aang barely felt the light vibrations as he drifted off to sleep. They were in a distinct pattern, almost like the slow patting of a finger on the ground. He disregarded it, thinking it was probably an errant badger mole. Deep in the mountains, it was nightfall by the time Naruto arrived at his destination. He hadn't known where he was going, only following the feeling. And now he stood surrounded by earth and stone. Who are you? I know you aren't the torchbearer. So what, and who are you? Naruto thought, the sentence bouncing around his mind. There was a loud rumble, akin to a tide of earth spilling from a mountainside. The voice that spoke was ancient, older than almost anything Naruto had heard before. I am the voice of Mother Terra. I am the first and eldest. I am the earth itself. I am Jengu, father of the earth and progenitor of the earthbenders. And you are an anomaly, so this part ends here. Alright, that's it for today's video, guys. Let me know in the comment section how was the story. And also don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I will meet you in another video. Bye bye.